and are saying to yourselves, you were hoping perhaps to get like, a lacrosse match or, a session on the benefits of static record cleaners, a little call-in talk show or something, and you're wondering why you should stay tuned for this kind of ponderous stuff. A very good example is all around us right now, which is the eruption recently of information that has been sort of dubbed by the press, Iran-gate, Contra-gate, or, Iran amok, or whatever, all these names they're trying to come up with it. But the central facts are that a lot of things about the conduct of foreign policy in this country, in this supposedly or putatively democratic country, have sort of come oozing to the surface from passing up through this veneer of respectability. And some people are honestly surprised. Now, of course, one step beyond listeners, our listeners up here at KFJC and people who listen to May Brussel and other people doing this kind of work, of course, they're not surprised at all. As a matter of fact, many of them knew it already and are more surprised at the surprise of others. But the facts are that these things are going on. They're not hidden. They are not occult in the sense of the word meaning, hidden or in the dark where you can't find it. These are things that are happening, in many cases, in broad daylight and being reported in the mainstream news media. But if you don't follow the media carefully, if you don't put stories together from different media, from radio, from books, from magazines, newspapers, if you don't combine these things and if you don't follow the stories over time, the entire picture remains hidden. You only see a little snippet here. Somebody gets killed here. Somebody over here gets arraigned on charges of, smuggling weapons. Somebody else over here is being investigated for financial dealings. And, these things taken separately mean virtually nothing. But when you know the players and you know the people's names and you know where they've been, you see that oftentimes, not always, but many times, these are all single parts of larger cases. And in fact, the Iran-Contra-gate thing going on now is just such a thing. And we're hearing not only about the illegal arms shipments to Iran, which is really small potatoes, but we're beginning to see a little more public knowledge of such things as the allegations that America's foreign policy frontmen, in this case the Contras, dealing in drugs. Well, a lot of people are shocked at the mere concept that the Contras would deal drugs, these people that we're giving money to. Well, as we're going to talk about tonight, one of the mainstream avenues of covert foreign policy in the United States for many, many years, about 30 years now, has been the use of the narcotics trade to fund and support American foreign policy, covert foreign policy, below the level of the democratic debate. And we're going to be looking at that in depth. And this has been going on for a long time. So if you're somebody who's been paying attention to the Iran-Nicaraguan affair and saying, gee, I wonder if that could really be true, well, if you listen to this and you tape it and you put it away, then you will have some information on your side that will suggest not only is it quite possibly true, but things like it have been going on for so long that it's virtually an institution in this country. And you'll be much better prepared to deal with the blizzard of misinformation that is issuing out of Washington right now.
Speaking of the Iranagua, or whatever you want to call it, Iran-Contra-gate, one of the things that has loomed very large in the background of that case is the primary involvement of our intelligence services in narcotics trafficking, and that is the subject of tonight's broadcast. And once again, reiterating what we said at the beginning, this program is intended for taping off the air and subsequent use as an audio study resource. This is not intended for casual listening, so if you have not already begun doing so, please tape this program off the air if you're in a position to do so, because we're about to get into the meat of the broadcast. Now, specifically, tonight, this is the third of our Radio Free America programs, probably going to be 5, it looks like, at this point, because we still haven't gotten to Klaus Barbie and some of the cocaine connections. But and then we have to knock off the age of psychedelia, which also came from the intelligence services. So this is the third of our broadcasts in the series dealing with the involvement of the U.S. intelligence agencies in the narcotics traffic. And what we're going to do this evening specifically is take a look at, among other things, the Drug Enforcement Administration, its use not only as a cover for the Central Intelligence Agency, but its use as, I guess you could say, the Drug Enforcement Administration, not the Drug Law Enforcement Administration, but rather enforcing the drug trade, not combating it, but affecting monopolies and regulating the trade, I think is the word I'm looking for, not attempting to stamp it out, or at least not in the way that most people think. We're going to take a look at An interesting case. The first thing we're going to be taking a look at this evening is an interesting case from a criminal syndicate called The Company, quote unquote. Now, many people who are familiar with the intelligence services in this country will recognize that The Company is a standard reference by CIA insiders to the Central Intelligence Agency. The question that we're going to be asking, sort of implicitly with the information we're about to present, is The Company, quote-unquote, an arms and drug smuggling ring? And the interrelationship between the arms traffic and the drug traffic is one of the things we focused on primarily in our last broadcast. And what we're going to be asking is basically, is The Company part of the company? And we're also going to take a look at an assassination, possibly two assassinations, involving elements of The Company, quote-unquote. That is to say, the criminal syndicate, which may or may not be, we obviously think it is part of the CIA, or at least elements thereof. And the first thing we're going to be hearing here is actually, I guess, literally part of the KFJC archives. This is a program called well, I shouldn't say it's now defunct. It's still aired on a couple of other stations. But on KFJC, a now-defunct program known as Hard Rain. This basically was this was part of the inspiration for our archive format. It was a half-hour-long program, which I did some years back, and many programs of which are now in our archive shows. This is a program done originally on 6/13/82, June 13th, 1982, and unfortunately, the articles which are contained in this particular tape are somewhere in our archives, but buried after one of a number of different moves that we had to effect. We do live in apartments and we move around, and somewhere they are buried in a box, I think, somewhere in my house. However, fortunately, we did get this stuff on tape, so rather than having to disembowel my entire residence, we're in a position to give this to you via tape.
Plus, you have this wonderful living example of why it's important to tape these things, because our newspaper articles and books are perishable, just like tapes are, but you can get more information onto a small tape and hang on to it and put it in a safe place than you can with 7,000 newspaper articles stacked in boxes or in filing cabinets or whatever.
I know roughly where the articles are, but it just wasn't possible to get at them at this point. So what you're going to be hearing is about 15 or 20 minutes of a tape from an old show that we used to have here on KFJC, and which is still heard on a couple of other stations in the Bay Area. It's called Hard Rain. The show is. This is a program about The Company, and this is Hard Rain program from June 13th, 1982. Anyway, the first of the articles that we're going to be dealing with tonight is going to introduce you to The Company and some of their activities. Now, the following story comes from the San Francisco Chronicle on April 28th, 1982, and this story is Dateline Fresno. It's an article by Bill Wallace, who's a Chronicle correspondent. It's Dateline Fresno, and it's entitled "The Story of Spies, Stolen Arms, and Drugs." The story reads as follows. A federal judge here began hearing testimony yesterday in a case involving spies, drug dealers, gun runners, and a shadowy group known to its own members as The Company. The defendants in the case, former Air Force Master Sergeant Larry Earl Bryant and inventor Alvin Snaper, are accused of stealing specialized military equipment, some of which is classified, from the top security U.S. naval weapons station at China Lake in the Mojave Desert. Bryant was indicted on 4 counts of receiving embezzled property, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of embezzlement. Snaper was accused of 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of embezzlement, and 1 count of receiving embezzled property. Both men have pleaded not guilty to the charges. U.S. District Judge Edward Dean Price is hearing the case without a jury, and the trial is expected to last about 2 weeks. Taken from the base were 9 infrared sniper scopes, a television camera for taking pictures in darkness, 1,500 rounds of small arms tracer ammunition for night combat, a 5-foot remote-controlled helicopter, and secret components from the radar unit of a Sidewinder-guided missile. Federal agents say some of the stolen equipment was going to be used to make electronic equipment for drug smugglers, and some was traded to drug smugglers in Colombia for marijuana. According to documents filed in the case, Bryant, 42, is a retired Air Force Master Sergeant from St. Louis, Missouri, who once worked at China Lake developing devices to counter foreign radar systems. Snaper was described as an inventor from Las Vegas. The Company, the drug smuggling organization to which police say Bryant and Snaper belong, apparently took its name from jargon for the CIA. The organization reputedly has about 300 members
many of them former military men or ex-police officers, and nearly $30 million worth of assets, including planes, ships, and real estate. Federal drug agents say the organization has imported billions of dollars worth of narcotics from Latin America and also was involved in gun running and mercenary operations. 25 reputed members of the group were indicted by the federal grand jury in Fresno last year on charges ranging from importing narcotics for sale to stealing classified armaments. The indictment did not name the company itself, however. Snaper and Bryant are the first defendants to stand trial on the charges in the Fresno indictment. According to the indictment, Larry Bryant and several other men police say are associated with the company took the military equipment from China Lake between January and October of 1979. 5 of the nightscopes were ultimately discovered in Snaper's garage in Las Vegas, and another one turned up when police raided a Lexington, Kentucky warehouse Bradley F. Bryant had rented under a pseudonym. Bradley Bryant is Larry Bryant's cousin and a man police say is one of the ringleaders of the company. He is being held in lieu of $1 million bond at a prison in Elgin, Illinois, awaiting trial on federal charges of selling $250,000 worth of marijuana to undercover narcotics agents. A 6th scope was found in the wreckage of a plane that crashed off the coast of Colombia. Authorities say the plane was on a drug smuggling mission when it crashed. The other 3 scopes disappeared entirely, as have the radar components and the remote-controlled helicopter. There have been several recent incidents apparently connected with the case. Last month, Andrew Carter Thornton II, one of the men who had pleaded guilty in the Fresno case, was shot 2 times in the chest at point-blank range by an unknown assailant as he walked out of a restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky. Thornton, a former narcotics officer, survived, but only because he was wearing a bulletproof vest. There have been no arrests in the shooting, and police say they have no suspects. In January, Gene Berry, a state prosecutor in Charlotte Harbor, Florida, was shot to death as he answered his door. Earlier this month, police arrested Bonnie Kelly as Berry's murderer. Kelly's husband, Wallace McClure Mike Kelly, is a suspected member of the company who pleaded guilty in the Fresno case last month. Charlotte County Sheriff Glenn Saper said the Berry slaying, while not related to the China Lake thefts, was a company assassination accomplished with the help of the group's members. Florida law enforcement officials say that Charles V. Harrelson, a convicted slayer indicted this month for the 1979 murder of U.S. District Judge John H. Wood in El Paso, is also a member of the company, unquote, and a close associate of Wallace Kelly. Police said Jamil Jimmy Chagra, a convicted drug dealer who is an indicted co-conspirator in the Wood assassination case, once hired Bradley Bryant's private security firm, staffed by reputed members of the company, as a bodyguard service. Well, that's a very complex tangle of names and places and events. I'd like to take a minute to outline that before we discuss the case, or discuss that article, and move on to some more articles about the case. Some of the names that we heard. Keep in mind Alvin Snaper. Alvin Snaper is the very talented inventor who, along with Mr. Larry Bryant, was indicted for allegedly stealing some very sophisticated weaponry from the China Lake Naval Weapons Center in the Mojave Desert. Now, Larry Bryant's cousin, Bradley Bryant, is currently in prison in Elgin, Illinois, awaiting under indictment, on marijuana smuggling charges. You heard in this story about a fellow named Andrew Carter Thornton II, who pleaded guilty in the Fresno case. Remember, Snaper and Larry Bryant are the first 2 to stand trial in the case. Well, Mr. Andrew Carter Thornton II pleaded guilty in the case and then was shot in the chest at point-blank range, although survived thanks to a bulletproof vest. Nobody has been indicted. No suspects have been uncovered in the case. You heard about Gene Berry, a Florida prosecutor who was murdered by a woman named Bonnie Kelly, who's the wife of Wallace Kelly, who's a fellow who is in the company. We also heard about a guy named Charles V. Harrelson, who's indicted for the assassination of federal judge John Wood, the only federal judge ever assassinated in the line of duty, by the way. And Charles V. Harrelson, who has been indicted for shooting Judge Wood, is a member of the company, and a fellow who is under indictment with him, a guy named Jamil Jimmy Chagra, once hired Bradley Bryant's private security firm, which apparently employs members of the company, unquote. A couple of things I'd like to point out. Longtime listeners to Hard Rain will recall that in February of 1981, we discussed the company. We read an article that was from the San Francisco Examiner, in December of 1980. And that article dealt with the company, and at that time, the weaponry stolen from China Lake was not, and the radar system stolen from China Lake was not to be traded for drugs or given to drug smugglers. One of the reasons that one of the people who had helped smuggle the stuff out of China Lake gave for having brought this out, apparently this person was told that this was going to be used by the CIA and exchanged in Libya for some Soviet-built radar equipment, I guess, that had been given to the Libyans, and which was going to be exchanged and given to the CIA for this stuff. So keep that in mind, that this information maintaining that the China Lake weaponry was to be given to drug smugglers or swapped for marijuana marks a significant change from the facts of the case, or the information about the case as we first saw it in December of 1980, or as we saw it in February of 81. This article was from late December of 1980. Now, you'll recall that in that very same Hard Rain broadcast from February of 1981, we took a look at the strange and ominous doings of the Turple Wilson Corcola wing of the CIA. We took a look at some Jack Anderson material, which later exploded into a very big story in the New York Times and all of the other papers. This concerned the activities of ex-unquote CIA men and special forces in training and arming Muammar Gaddafi's security people and terrorists and so forth. And it appeared pretty clear from those two stories. It appeared to be pretty clear that basically these people were not ex-CIA at all, that they were still with the company. And among the activities, among the bases that were touched by Turple Wilson Corcola and company, among those bases was China Lake. They were involved with the smuggling of weaponry from China Lake to Libya. This was part of the Turple Wilson Corcola scam. So keep in mind the interesting coincidence here between the company, unquote, and Turple Wilson Corcola, Libya, etc. Now, one of the most important connections to the company here concerns the assassination of federal Judge John Wood in Texas. Now, you'll recall that Charles V. Harrelson, who's been indicted on the case, is a member of the company. His co-indictee in the case, Jimmy Chagra, once used Bradley Bryant's security service, which basically is staffed by people from the company, for bodyguards. Now, keep that in mind, because a very significant connection appeared concerning the company and the assassination of Judge Wood. This story appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on Thursday, April 22nd of 1982. It's a one-sentence story, only one sentence, and this is the only paper I even saw it in. It's a UPI story, dateline New Orleans, and headlined perjury charges. It reads as follows. Joseph P. Marcello, Jr., 58, the brother of reputed mafia boss Carlos Marcello, surrendered to federal authorities yesterday on charges he lied to a grand jury investigating the assassination of a federal judge in Texas. Now, it was we saw at the top of the broadcast, the assassination of Judge Wood is the only assassination of a federal judge that has ever taken place. No judge has ever been offed in connection with his work. No federal judge, that is. And so when the article that we just saw makes a very oblique reference to the assassination of a federal judge in Texas, that is definitely Judge Wood. That's whose assassination this refers to. Now, this is significant. Carlos Marcello is a name that crops up frequently in the investigation of you might call what one might call the underbelly of the United States. He has massive mafia connections. He's also done work for the CIA in the past. Longtime Hard Rain listeners will recall that in the early summer of 1980, about 2 years ago, we dealt with Mr. Carlos Marcello in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. The House Select Committee on Assassinations named Marcello and his associate David Ferry as probable conspirators in the assassination of President Kennedy. That came as no surprise to people that had been studying the JFK assassination, because certainly Carlos Marcello's name is one of those that crops up most frequently, and it certainly appears that he was involved in some way with the assassination of President Kennedy. So keep in mind the brother of Carlos Marcello is being indicted on perjury in connection with the Judge Wood assassination case, because his brother, Carlos Marcello, is a very, very important figure.
All right, and we are back live in the studios at KFJC. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emory, and of course what you just heard was a segment of a Hard Rain broadcast from June 13th, 1982. And that was to introduce you to the topic tonight. For those of you who tuned in after the beginning of the broadcast and our introduction, this is the third of a 5-part series on the connection between intelligence and the international narcotics trade. And what this particular tape was referring to, or was an introduction to, was the strange situation of The Company, a drugs and guns outfit known as The Company, which also just happens to be, coincidentally or otherwise, which is what we are trying to ascertain, a well-known nickname among its initiates for the CIA, or for CIA. And what we're going to be examining is how some of the folks in The Company, the guns and drugs operation, connect up with some other people who are known confidants, intimates, or whatever you might want to say, of the real-life, honest-to-God, Langley, Virginia CIA.
Right, and what we're going to be taking a look at in particular now is one of the company, quote-unquote, operations, namely the assassination of federal judge John Wood in 1979, the only federal judge so far, at least the only federal judge that's on record. I've noted some interesting apparent heart attacks of judges, but the only assassination shooting of a judge so far. Basically now, reviewing a couple of the pieces of information that will relate to what we're talking about here, it's worth noting, among other things, the number of people who have been assassinated in connection with various investigations into the company. Members of the company, key witnesses, a prosecutor in Florida, or district attorney, I can't remember which, named Barry, was shot at. And as we're going to see, the mortality rate in and around this arms and drug smuggling ring, which appears, at least from circumstantial evidence, to be part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, well, the mortality rate has been very, very high. And recall also that the high-tech weaponry being smuggled from China Lake Naval Weapons Center, which is an extremely high-security area. I mean, you just don't waltz in there and walk out with a purchase order for, Starlight sniper scopes and things of that type. Keep in mind that was the area from which Messrs. Turple and Wilson got much of their high-tech weaponry to send to our boy Mohammed Gaddafi in Libya. Now, as we've looked at, Turple and Wilson's Libyan operation was not an ex-U.S. intelligence operation at all. If indeed it was not CIA, then it was certainly working for one of our other intelligence services, either the NSC, the NSA, the DIA, or one of the others. The circumstantial evidence is that there may have very well been a connection between the company, quote-unquote, and the Turple-Wilson operation. The first report on the company had the weaponry going to Libya, and then it said that it was going to drug smugglers in South America. Both may, in fact, have been true, but the China Lakes connection here is very, very important. Remember the high mortality rate in connection with this, and also, and not unimportantly, remember the fact that the Marcello clan has cropped up in connection with the investigation into the assassination of Judge John Wood, because, in a sense, our takeoff point at this juncture for the bulk of the discussion this evening is going to be some of the information that surfaced in connection with the assassination of Judge John Wood. And remember Joseph Marcello, Carlos Marcello's brother, he was being represented by a very, very interesting figure and a very important name on the American far right.
Now, before we get to the article, one more thing. Wanted to take it out to macro focus again for a moment and then bring it back down to the article. As Dave mentioned, the China Lake case, of which the company is supposedly involved in the theft or the smuggling out of these weapons. And as Dave also mentioned, the China Lake weapons repository is also linked intimately to the Turple-Wilson gang, or whatever you want to call them, and their shipments of arms originally to Libya, also possibly to Central and South America. At the beginning of tonight's broadcast, I made a sort of a larger point about one of the reasons that we're interested in the intelligence and narcotics connection, because of the surfacing of these allegations within the Iran/Nicaragua case. Now, interestingly enough, not only, of course, is Ed Wilson, just by his very the people he hangs out with, connected in a larger sense to most of these intelligence scams going on right now, but he and Richard Secord and some other people are very explicitly connected to the arms shipments to Iran and others. So, again, a connection here between the China Lake case and the company, and Ed Wilson was certainly a company employee in the sense of the CIA meaning of the word, but a connection between Ed Wilson and the China Lake case, and also now Ed Wilson and his buddies connected seemingly, certainly to the Libyan case, also connected to the Iran case, means that this 3-year-old murder, a 5-year-old murder now that we're talking about, may be more intimately connected to the current goings-on than anybody has previously thought. Now, again, Dave mentioned Joseph Marcello, the infamous Marcello family.
One quick reference, Nip. The China Lake connection was actually discussed in Radio Free America number 4, our program about the Turple Wilson operation. And then also brought up again very briefly. And actually, maybe we only read the headline, but then in RFA number 22. So if people would like to go back and review in a hard way the China Lake connection to Turple Wilson, those are the RFA references.
Indeed. Now, the Marcello family, as mentioned, a rather interesting family. Carlos Marcello, of course, intimately connected with the drug trade through his mafia connections, and also, of course, excuse me, a long-time name that has been mentioned in conjunction with the Kennedy assassination, time and time again, which, of course, we will also be talking about later in the broadcast.
Right, and again, a quick archive reference. Guns of November number 1, we discussed the Marcello connection and his relationship with David Ferry.
Now, the other name that Dave mentioned is the name of a well-known attorney who has just recently shuffled off the mortal coil, and I'm sure you will recognize that name when we get to it. The article that we are reading is from the New Orleans Times-Picayune for Tuesday, September 21st, 1982. This article was originally provided to us back in 1982 by Ted Rubenstein, a researcher who has done a lot of good work and shared it with us, and who we have talked about before. The headline is Marcello Kin's Trial Postponed. Kin, of course, K-I-N apostrophe S. The dateline is San Antonio. It's a UPI wire story. A perjury trial for New Orleans restaurateur Joseph Marcello was postponed Monday because his attorney is out of the country. Federal Judge H.F. Hippo Garcia set no other date for Marcello's trial, which was to have begun with jury selection Tuesday. Attorney Roy Cohn asked for the delay because he had to be in Europe. Marcello, the leader of reputed organized crime leader Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, is accused of lying to a grand jury about his knowledge of the 1979 assassination of federal judge John Wood of San Antonio. Although neither Marcello is accused in the slaying, federal prosecutors say they have a tape of Joseph Marcello telling someone he knew who was involved. Quote, "These are the people that connected with the killing of the judge in El Paso," unquote, Marcello said. "The judge is dead. This was their 3 people," unquote. But when asked about the tape in June 1980 before a grand jury investigating Wood's death, Marcello refused to identify his voice or acknowledge the conversation, prosecutors said. The tape was made at Carlos Marcello's office in connection with the federal BRILAB investigation, B-R-I-L-A-B.
Alrighty, now Roy Cohn, of course, is one of the luminaries of the he's dead now, of AIDS. It was one of the luminaries of the American far right, perhaps best known for his work as the counsel to Joe McCarthy, the late senator from Wisconsin, who, in essence, trashed an entire generation of American politicos whose politics fell anywhere to the left of far right, and was responsible for almost single-handedly driving the American political spectrum several clicks to the right through his investigations. Roy Cohn was his notorious chief counsel. Beyond that, Roy Cohn has worked with such organizations as Western Goals, the organization which was involved in a very notorious police spying case a couple of years back, and which was headed up by the late Larry McDonald, who died in the crash of Korean Airlines Flight 007. Also in Radio Free America, in Farewell America, a book put out by the French intelligence service about the Kennedy assassination, Roy Cohn is implicated in the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, that's interesting, of course, because he's representing the brother of one of the organized crime figures who, in all probability, was also a participant in the Kennedy assassination. There were a number of organized crime links to the assassination of John Kennedy. Carlos Marcello appears to have been one of them. Now, it's interesting that this whole thing, this perjury case, cropped up in connection with the assassination of Judge John Wood, because there were allegations by none other than the convicted assassin of Judge John Wood that, in fact, the case connected up with the assassination of President Kennedy. Again, research credit for the following story goes to Ted Rubenstein. This is from the San Francisco Examiner of Tuesday, November 2nd of 1982. It's a UPI story, dateline San Antonio, Texas, and headlined, "Witness says hitman is killer of Judge JFK." Judge, JFK. A convicted hitman claimed he killed both President John F. Kennedy and U.S. District Judge John H. Wood, Jr., and planned to use that information to bargain with the government. A lawyer who pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in the case testified today. Joe Chagra, C-H-A-G-R-A, said Charles Harrelson, H-A-R-R-E-L-S-O-N, insisted he had killed Kennedy and even drew a map of the area in Dallas where Kennedy was shot in 1963. Chagre said Harrelson also told him that he hoped the information could get him a life sentence in a comfortable federal prison instead of the Texas penitentiary. If he made a deal with the government, he could clear up the Kennedy matter as well as clear up the Judge Wood matter, Chagre said. Although Harrelson claimed to have been cleared by a 1980 grand jury in Wood's 1979 shooting death, he said he could still prove he killed Wood with, quote, an ace in the hole, the murder weapon itself, Chagre said. In the same visit with Chagre, September 24, 1980, Harrelson drew a second map of the area east of Dallas where, he said, the rifle he used to kill Wood was tossed from a bridge. Chagre reproduced the map later, and the FBI found it in a search of his home in February of 1981. So it's intriguing that the confessed assassin of Judge John Wood also has confessed to being one of the fire team that dispatched President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. And there have been a number of follow-up articles about the possibility that Harrelson may have been one of a number of riflemen in Dallas, Texas. And there are some interesting connecting links between Charles Harrelson and some of the people, in particular some of the organized crime people who not only figure in the background of the assassination of President Kennedy, but who also are going to be front and center in our discussion about the interrelationship between the intelligence services, organized crime, and the narcotics traffic.
All right, now one of the things that we're going to examine here for a moment is we examine the strange case of Charles V. Harrelson, the man who says that he was one of the assassins of John F. Kennedy. We're going to talk about one of the most famous bits of arcana in the study of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and that's the Dealey Plaza tramps, as they have been called. And there was a brief flurry that many of you out there who have followed political matters may have heard of for a while, where there were strong suggestions that the tramps were in fact Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt of Watergate fame. That largely came to naught, although there certainly was some rather interesting similarities between one of the men and E. Howard Hunt in terms of just sheer facial looks. But we're going to look at another viewpoint on that in light of Charles Harrison's confession. This article originally appeared in the Cover Up's newsletter of July 1982, published by Gary Mack in Fort Worth, Texas.
And research credit for this also goes to Ted Rubenstein.
And the article is headlined, "Is Kennedy's Assassin Sitting in Texas Jail?" We're going to skip down to partway into the article where he discusses the three, quote, tramps and how they made their way into the annals of Kennedy assassination research. They're talking about events that occurred right after the shooting of President Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. For those of you who don't know, by the way, there's a railroad track running right alongside, and this is the center for a lot of this activity. A Union Pacific train dispatcher named Lee Bowers said he saw three men sneak into an empty railroad car in the Union rail yards just behind the Texas School Book Depository moments after the assassination. Bowers had the train halted when it began to move out of the yards and summoned Dallas police. Several policemen rousted the three men out of the rail car at gunpoint and marched them back past the book depository to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, located on the east side of Dealey Plaza. At least two newsmen took photographs of the men as they were marched through the plaza under armed guard. However, once in Dallas police custody, the men officially disappeared. They were never booked, and any fingerprints or names that were taken have never been made public. These three men remain among only 5 or 6 people that the FBI failed to identify who were on the scene at the time of the assassination. For 19 years, there has been considerable speculation as to the identities and activities of these three men. Although they were called tramps by police, photos show the men had recent haircuts, shined shoes, and old but unsoiled clothes. In photographs, they hardly appeared to be tramps. Skipping down in the article. And they're talking about the guy who wrote this article took a picture of Harrelson to a graphics expert to ask him, after Harrelson's confession, if he could possibly be one of the men in one of the three tramps that were photographed by news photographers. Jack White, a Fort Worth graphics expert and assassination researcher, who testified before the House Select Committee on Assassination, told me, meaning Jim Mars who wrote the article, told me he is now convinced that Harrelson is the younger tramp. Quote, "I have done various photographic comparison tests and everything matches. The hair, the nose, the ear. It's Harrelson in my mind," said White, a longtime advertising man here. In addition to the photo comparisons, there is yet more evidence to indicate that Harrelson did indeed play a role in the presidential assassination. When arrested, Harrelson was carrying the business card of R.D. Matthews. In subsequent interviews, Harrelson admitted being a close friend of Matthews and said he looked up to Matthews as a father. Russell Douglas Matthews is a former Dallas character who was close to Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby, the man who shot down accused presidential assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Matthews was described by the House Assassinations Committee as a man, quote, actively engaged in criminal activity since the 1940s. The committee also documented Matthews' connections with Dallas gamblers Louis McWillie and Benny Binion, both of whom were Ruby's close friends. The committee also developed evidence that Matthews was in contact with associates of Mafia chieftain Santos Trafficante of Florida. Excuse me. Matthews was linked by the committee to Fort Worth and Dallas underworld characters such as Hollis DeLois Green, Jetty Bass, Nick Cassio, and James Todd. These men, as well as Matthews, were acquaintances of Harrelson. In a sidelight, Matthews was best man at the marriage of a Dallas underworld character named George McGann to a woman named Beverly Oliver. Beverly Oliver, a nightclub entertainer, was close friends with several of Jack Ruby's employees and was in Dealey Plaza filming the Kennedy motorcade at the time of the assassination. Mrs. Oliver, now an evangelist using a different name, said 2 FBI agents took her unprocessed film, shot from the south side of Elm Street, and promised to return the original print after it was developed. She now states that she never saw or heard of the film again.
Now, a couple of interesting points to make in connection with this particular article. Obviously, it's interesting that there is this series of connections between Charles Harrelson and some of the organized crime figures who crop up in the background of the assassination of John Kennedy, or, as is the case with Jack Ruby, in the foreground of the John F. Kennedy assassination. It's interesting, too, that there are connecting links between Charles Harrelson and Santos Trafficante. In other words, connecting links meaning a set of mutual associations. Santos Trafficante, again, we covered this in Guns of November #1, the first of our archive shows about President Kennedy's assassination. Santos Trafficante was known to have boasted or stated to a fellow Cuban exile named Jose Aleman that, quote, President Kennedy is going to be hit in the middle of ranting and raving about how bad it was that the Kennedys were down on Jimmy Hoffa. Santos Trafficante stated that President Kennedy was going to be hit and that a nut would no, I guess that was Marcello who said a nut would do the job. Anyway, Santos Trafficante said, after Jose Aleman expressed the opinion that President Kennedy would probably be reelected, Santos Trafficante said, no, Jose, you're wrong. He is going to be hit. Now, that's an interesting statement for Santos Trafficante to make, because when he was subpoenaed to appear before a congressional subcommittee, he was obviously terrified to appear before that subcommittee, perhaps because fellow mafiosi Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli were murdered in connection with their testimony. Roselli just after testifying, Giancana just before. Santos Trafficante is a very, very hardened individual, not somebody who would blanch at something as relatively innocuous as testifying normally. So it's worth bearing in mind the probable connections between Santos Trafficante and the assassination of President Kennedy, because Santos Trafficante and his links to, among others, Richard Nixon and the Central Intelligence Agency is going to be one of the people who's front and center in our broadcast this evening. I would also state that although the reproduction of the picture, the mugshot of Charles Harrelson shown in the cover-ups issue that Nip just read you, is not terribly good, I have seen other photographs comparing the large tramp, the young tramp as he was known. He was the youngest of the 3 tramps, and Charles Harrelson on the basis, for example, of photographs in Penn Jones' newsletter, The Continuing Inquiry. I personally, and obviously this is just my opinion, I'm absolutely convinced that Charles Harrelson is indeed the 3rd tramp, the young tramp. Many not terribly skilled researchers have suggested that young tramp was Frank Sturgis. It's been pretty positively proved that was not Frank Sturgis. I am personally convinced that Charles Harrelson was indeed the so-called young tramp, one of the 3 men arrested. It's worth noting that Lee Bowers was one of the people we covered in Guns of November #2, one of the mysterious deaths, or perhaps not so mysterious deaths, in connection with the Kennedy assassination.
We should just remind you, Lee Bowers was the railroad switching man who caught the tramps and called the police and had the tramps taken off, from whence they subsequently disappeared from the Dallas police station.
And again, I think the comparative photographic evidence of Charles Harrelson Harrelson's mugshot and the youngest and largest of the three tramps is very, very compelling. However, a separate but but related question, rather, is whether or not, although I'm convinced he was one of the tramps, whether or not he was actually a member of the fire team that dispatched President Kennedy is another question. It seems probable that the three tramps played some role in the assassination, but they may very well have not been the actual triggermen. That remains to be seen. I'm not saying that Charles Harrelson was the triggerman. I am convinced he was the youngest of the tramps. So whether or not the tramps were in any way involved in the actual shooting has yet to be proved. I think that should be stated because a lot of people have automatically assumed that those tramps were some of the fire team, and that is not necessarily the case. I am convinced that Harrelson was indeed the youngest tramp, and whether or not he was a member of the fire team remains to be seen. As we like to say, food for thought and grounds for further research. Now, it's worth noting, again, hearkening back to the Hard Rain tape segment that we began with, that there's been a lot of mortality in connection with the investigation into this arms and drug smuggling ring called The Company, which may very well have been part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. When members of The Company came to trial, there were a number of death threats and alleged death threats going around. One of them was a threat against the judge hearing one of the cases. Research credit once again for this article goes to Ted Rubenstein. This is from the Fresno Bee of July 9th of 1982. It's by Royal Calkins, C-A-L-K-I-N-S, a Fresno Bee staff writer, and it's headlined, Special Protection Given Judge Price After Death Threats. For 4 months, U.S. District Court Judge Edward Dean Price of Fresno has been under round-the-clock guard because of death threats and additional concerns stemming from the 1979 assassination of a federal judge in Texas. Deputy U.S. Marshals are expected to continue providing special protection for Price for about a year, said Mike Nelson, deputy in charge of the U.S. Marshal's office in Fresno. Nelson would not comment on the reasons, but others said Price received death threats in connection with upcoming trials of 25 alleged members of the Nuestra Familia gang. Proceedings against the 25 defendants were moved from Fresno to Sacramento for security reasons, but Price is still handling the cases. Also contributing to the decision, for sources said, was a recent trial in Price's courtroom involving thefts of weapons and other military hardware from China Lake Naval Weapons Center in the Mojave Desert. Federal authorities say one of the defendants in that case, Bradley Bryant, previously worked for drug smuggler Jamil A. Chagra, C-H-A-G-R-A, one of 5 people indicted for the sniper slaying of U.S. District Judge John Wood, Jr. of San Antonio, Texas in May of 1979. 3 federal officials said Bryant put Chagra in touch with the contract killer who fired the fatal rifle shot at Judge Wood, a Kentucky newspaper recently reported. And the threats against Judge Price were not the only threats, or not the only assassination plots in connection with the Judge Wood case.
This is a rather interesting little sidelight that originally this article appeared in the East Bay Today, the Oakland Tribune / East Bay Today for Tuesday, October 19th, 1982. The headline is Assassination Offer, and under it we have this small, interesting, but somewhat incomplete article. It's Dateline San Antonio, Texas. An FBI informer testified Monday that he once was offered $50,000 to kill Charles V. Harrelson, who is on trial, charged with assassinating U.S. District Judge John H. Wood, Jr. Hampton Robinson III, age 34, an admitted former heroin and cocaine addict who was given methadone before his court appearance, made the statement during his rambling testimony. Harrelson is on trial for the May 29, 1979 killing of Wood. The 63-year-old jurist was shot down outside his San Antonio townhouse. Now, this is interesting. Now, admittedly, the man who made this allegation, as they said, was in the midst of a somewhat rambling testimony and was given methadone before his court appearance. However, mitigating those facts is that, first of all, methadone, from my understanding of those types of the pseudo opiates, is not necessarily the type of drug to lead you to make things up. If anything, it tends to release inhibitions. But my not being a doctor, that certainly can't be taken as gospel. However, what I would say is I don't think the fact that he was given methadone necessarily undermines the validity of his charge, which is at this point, of course, obviously unproved. The other rather interesting thing, though, is that if it is something that he made up, it seems to me that somebody on drugs is going to make up something to tell in court it seems to me they would make up something a little more interesting to the general public, or to people involved, than an allegation that somebody offered him $50,000 to kill Charles Harrelson, who even at the time when this case was current was not a tremendously important person and not tremendously significant outside of the intelligence and assassination milieu. So that being the case, we do wonder, reading this article, we notice that the guy is an FBI informant, but we're curious, it does not mention, and I don't think we've ever found out, who it was exactly who allegedly offered Hampton Robinson $50,000 to kill Charles Harrelson, and at what time and in what situation was he offered that money. So that's something to put into the damper, though, and hang on to for some later point. But as Dave said, there are a lot of deaths and allegations of assassination attempts and things swirling around this case of the company.
And one person whose death was far more than an allegation in connection with the Judge Wood case was a former San Antonio San Antonio policeman and prizefighter named Benjamin Boyd Smith. He was assassinated most definitely, and he also was involved in the investigation into the killing of Judge John Wood. Once again, research credit for the following article goes to Ted Rubenstein. It's from the San Antonio Express, specifically from the San Antonio Express of September 1st, 1982. The headline is Wood Investigation Figure Found Slain, and it's by Karen Kennedy and Tom Nelson of the San Antonio Express, and it reads as follows. A former San Antonio policeman and prizefighter with ties to the Judge John Wood assassination investigation through his Las Vegas gambling connections was found shot and strangled in the trunk of a car left in an Austin warehouse district. Benjamin Boyd Smith, 54, had been dead at least 4 days before his body was discovered Monday morning. The Travis County coroner's report said he had been shot twice in the head and strangled with a rope. Smith had been a San Antonio police officer for 2 years before pursuing a career as a professional boxer. He later spent 10 years in prison and most recently worked as a debt collector for Las Vegas gambling interests. Smith may have been questioned during the federal probe of the May 29, 1979 Wood assassination because he had been a bodyguard for Las Vegas gambler Jack Strauss. Strauss, who won last year's World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, testified before the grand jury that he knew convicted drug smuggler Jimmy Chagra, who has been indicted on charges of arranging the assassination of the federal judge. Although Smith never appeared before the grand jury, government sources said he may have been questioned by investigators. So the death of Benjamin Boyd Smith is another thing to keep in mind, yet another death in connection with the assassination of Judge John Wood. So again, bearing in mind the people discussed in the article that we in the tape segment that we covered, it's worth considering who might have dispatched Mr. Boyd Smith, why they might have done it. Bear in mind the threat against Judge Price. Bear in mind the allegations of an attempt to put out a contract on Charles Harrelson. Bear in mind the possible connections of Charles Harrelson to the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, probable connections in light of his probable role as the youngest tramp.
Just before we go on to some other things, I want to mention broadcasting from Foothill College. This is KFJC, Los Altos Hills. For those of you out there who are listening to this and saying, well, even if these killings and attempted killings and all that are connected, so what? It's it's a bunch of crooks and gamblers and drug smugglers down in Texas who killed a federal judge probably, and things like that. And so what? Just to let you know, what we're going to do is we're going to begin taking some of these names, some of the high-profile names, as Dave mentioned, like Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and others in the later part of the broadcast, and we're going to begin piecing this into the larger national and international drugs and intelligence connection. So again, we're talking about this particular case because it opens some very interesting windows, namely, again, the Charles Harrelson connection possibly to the Kennedy assassination. But in the larger picture, it also fits in very much with, as I was saying earlier, things that are going on right now in terms of things that our government have probably been involved in Central and South America.
And again, recalling some of the information from the tape segment, this group is an arms and drug smuggling ring with the same nickname as our Central Intelligence Agency, they had access to weaponry at China Lake Naval Weapons Center. That is an extremely high security installation. You just don't go waltzing in and out of China Lake with the kinds of material that they were able to get their hands on. Remember also the very possible connection to Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, because in the first article alluded to in the tape segment, it mentioned that the company, quote-unquote, was getting the material, the China Lake weapons, to Libya. That's where Wilson and Turple were getting their weapons to. And again, the Kennedy assassination, possible Kennedy assassination connection. It's worth noting, too, one article we did not read, but they were, at one point, the company was reported to have been hired to assassinate the Ayatollah Khomeini. So the context in which they appear is one that strongly suggests intelligence connections.
Now, here's a rather interesting article, especially taken in context with the article coming right after it that Dave is going to read. This is from the San Jose Mercury for Thursday, September 9th, 1982. The headline is Confession Reported in Slaying of Judge. Dateline San Antonio. It's an AP story. A woman charged with conspiracy in the murder of a federal judge wrote a repentant letter to the judge's widow, confessing her role in the killing, local news media reported Wednesday. In the letter to Catherine Wood, Elizabeth Chagra said her husband told her he planned to have U.S. District Judge John H. Wood, Jr. killed, and said she later delivered $250,000 in payment for the assassination. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram and WFAA-TV in Dallas quoted unidentified sources as saying. The San Antonio Express and the San Antonio Light also quoted sources as saying Mrs. Chagra admitted delivering the payment and said in the letter that she was apologetic. The Star-Telegram quoted a source as saying that, in the letter sent from her Bexar County jail cell, Mrs. Chagra said her husband walked into the kitchen of their El Paso home while she was cooking and told her he had decided to arrange Wood's death. The source said she wrote that she later was chosen to deliver the payment because she was the only one Chagra could trust, the newspaper reported. Neither Mrs. Wood nor Assistant U.S. Attorney Ray John, JHN, would comment on the reports. Calls Tuesday night and Wednesday to Mrs. Chagra's lawyer, Warren Burnett of Galveston, were not returned. Mrs. Chagra, age 28, is accused of conspiring with her husband, Jimmy Chagra, age 39, his brother, El Paso attorney Joseph Chagra, age 35, and convicted hitman Charles V. Harrelson, age 44, to kill Wood in San Antonio on May 29, 1979. So, according to these series of articles written in the local newspapers, and apparently carrying quite a lot of detail, Elizabeth Chagra, the wife of quote, Jimmy Chagra, actually confessed in a letter to the judge's widow that she had been informed of and, in fact, after the fact, was part of the assassination of Judge John Wood.
Does not appear, though, that his wife's, Jamil Chagra's wife's testimony had much of an effect on the outcome of the case.
It should be noted, if that was in fact the case, that I think even in a letter a wife's testimony cannot be used against her husband. However, it seems that if it was she was so ready to confess that other information should have been developed out of that would have been could have been used to find Chagra guilty of such a large-scale crime.
Following story is from the San Francisco Chronicle of Tuesday, February 8, 1983. State line Jacksonville, Florida, and it's a UPI story headlined, Gambler Acquitted of Hiring Judge's Killer. Jimmy Chagra, a Las Vegas gambler serving 30 years in prison on drug charges, was found not guilty yesterday of hiring the killer who shot down U.S. District Judge John Wood in San Antonio, Texas. A 10-woman, 2-man jury found Chagra not guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder, but convicted him on 2 lesser counts, conspiracy to obstruct justice and conspiracy to possess drugs. The government claimed Chagra had Wood killed in May of 1979 to avoid having to face trial in his court. A 39-year-old Chagra, a licensed professional gambler, was accused of paying Charles V. Harrelson $250,000 to kill the 61-year-old judge May 29, 1979. Harrelson, 44, was convicted of Wood's murder in San Antonio in December. So again, as Nip indicated, the acquittal of Jimmy Chagra is, in and of itself does not prove anything. It's interesting to note, though, the interesting convolutions the case has taken. The death of the murder of a possible witness, threats against judges, which certainly would have to carry some weight after the assassination of Judge John Wood, the allegation by an FBI informant that he was being hired to kill Charles Harrelson, Who would have hired him, if that's true, and why, remains a subject of speculation. The possible connections to Charles Harrelson and possibly also the Marcello clan, the assassination of President Kennedy, are worth keeping in mind. And again, the intelligence-related context in which the company, quote-unquote, exists are worth thinking about here. And perhaps the single most intriguing aspect of the assassination of Judge John Wood, and again, just one of a number of killings and attempted killings attributed to the company, quote-unquote, perhaps the single most important, at least for our purposes now, aspect of it that surfaced were allegations by Charles Harrelson that the Drug Enforcement Administration had the judge assassinated.
Indeed. This article is from the San Francisco Examiner for Thursday, December 16th, 1982. The headline is, Killer Says Judge Slain by the DEA. Dateline San Antonio, UPI Wire story. Federal Judge John Wood had information that would have, quote, blown the lid off the Drug Enforcement Administration when he was killed, probably by renegade government agents, says the man convicted of Wood's murder. Charles Harrelson held a press conference yesterday in the chapel of the Bexar County Jail, a day after he and two women were convicted of complicity in the slaying. Quote, I believe the government is in possession of evidence that shows conclusively I did not murder the judge, Harrelson said. I believe I was under surveillance the morning of May 29, 1979. Harrelson testified he was at his Dallas apartment when Wood was shot here, 275 miles away. Harrelson said during his 7 days of testimony that, quote, rogue elements of the U.S. government killed Wood. He elaborated at the press conference, saying that the DEA killed Wood to keep him revealing that, quote, 95% of the drugs brought in this country are imported by the DEA. Let me go back and read these last two paragraphs because I think they're rather interesting, even if they are the claims of a convicted murderer, because of the facts that we're going to be examining later in the broadcast. Harrelson said during his 7 days of testimony that, quote, rogue elements of the U.S. government killed Judge Wood. He elaborated at the press conference, saying the DEA killed Wood to keep him from revealing that, quote, 95% of the drugs brought in this country are imported by the DEA. Harrelson, for the first time, brought up the name of El Paso, Texas lawyer Lee Chagra, elder brother of Jimmy Chagra, whose trial is pending on charges he hired Harrelson to kill Wood. Lee Chagra was killed in his office in December 1978 in an apparent robbery. Two soldiers later were convicted of the slaying. Quote, I believe Lee Chagra had transmitted information to Judge Wood that would have blown the lid off the DEA, unquote, Harrelson said. So, of course, Lee Chagra also apparently a question mark to add on to the death list, but more significantly for our purposes and for the broadcast we're looking at tonight, the allegations by Charles Harrelson, who has made, in the course of our examining this case, has made two very seemingly outrageous and sweeping allegations. One, that he was in fact one of the assassins of John F. Kennedy, which of course flies in the face of the conventional government wisdom, although as polls will tell you, not in the face of the wisdom of most people who are pretty willing to believe that there was some kind of conspiracy involved in the Kennedy assassination.
Excuse me, or as we indicated in the Guns of November, the laws of physics will also impel you in the same general direction.
Not to mention the final, however much flawed it might be, judgment of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who also said it was probably an assassination conspiracy.
Excuse me, again, not only that, but they identified David Ferry, who was the chief object of Jim Garrison's investigation, as the probable conspirator, and recommended to the Justice Department that they begin investigation not only of Ferry's situation, but in particular his relationship with Carlos Marcello and the anti-Castro Cubans used by the CIA in the Bay of Pigs. And in particular, the anti-Castro Cubans are going to figure front and center in our broadcast this evening. But again, bearing in mind, as Nip indicated, the allegations by Charles Harrelson, because they're going to dovetail very, very neatly with a lot of information that we're going to be presenting on the rest of the broadcast.
That's right. So we have the first very wild, seemingly wild allegation that Harrelson, not Lee Harvey Oswald, was part of the assassination hit team that killed John F. Kennedy, and we have a second allegation that the rogue elements of the U.S. government killed Judge John Wood, and they did it because Wood had information about the DEA bringing, in Harrelson's words, 95% of the drugs into the country. Two seemingly wild allegations, and well, we've examined the Kennedy assassination in the past. Those of you who have been been with us for those know about how wild those kind of allegations sound, or how very not wild they sound in light of the actual evidence. And by the end of the broadcast tonight, perhaps some of Mr. Harrelson's allegations about the DEA will be looked at in a slightly different light as well. However, all of that is going to happen after we take a break and give you all a chance to get up and stretch, since we've been a long first segment of the broadcast tonight. So don't go away. Dave, Emory, myself, and Nip Tuck have lots more stuff that we want to share with you, and it's going to be an interesting show. Don't go away. We'll have more of Radio Free America in just a few minutes after this musical break right here on KFJC. Station or something like that you let us know, so we know where they're going to. But other than that, if you just want to share them with some friends, send copies to somebody, to your grandmother, your Aunt Minnie, your congressman, your best friend, your worst enemy who might need to be depressed a little bit about the State of the Union or something. That's fine with us. That's all we ask. So
yeah, again, if people want to play them on other stations, that's fine. So far, they're being played in part or in whole on at least 5 stations that we know of, including this one. So it's fine, as long as you check with us first. We don't want them used for comedy, as a recent station did, so check it out first.
Indeed. And should also just mention again that we're going to be here until 11 o'clock tonight. This is not a phone-in broadcast, so if you're only waiting around to phone and ask questions, that will probably not happen. But if you've got a question to ask, we do, of course, have our regular broadcasts on Sunday that run from 8 o'clock until 11 o'clock, where we do take phone calls and where we cover these kinds of things, except we usually have 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 12 topics during a given broadcast. So just to let you know again real quickly, we've been talking about the company. We've been talking about the company with the focus initially in the first part of the broadcast being on the death of Judge John Wood of San Antonio, the first federal judge ever to be murdered. And at least as far as we know, the first judge to be murdered. He was apparently murdered because of his work in as a judge on some drug smuggling cases. A man named Jimmy Shagra, a professional gambler who was already doing time for drug offenses, was acquitted, although the man that he reputedly hired to perform the case was not acquitted and was found guilty, a man named Charles V. Harrelson. Charles V. Harrelson also had some other interesting things to say. We talked about some of his connections into the Dallas underworld and the milieu that produced some of the people involved in the Kennedy assassination, which was significant for a variety of reasons. First off, being that Harrelson himself said that he had been a member of the Kennedy assassination team, and secondly, because Harrelson said that the reason John Wood had been killed, it had not been by him, it had been by the government, and it was because John Wood had been in possession of information about how vastly involved the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, was with the importation of drugs into this country. So the affiliation of John Harrelson with a lot of the milieu of the Kennedy assassination, most notably including certain aspects of organized crime, people like Santos Traficante and Carlos Marcello, and with the Cuban exile community, will be highly significant as we move into the drug and intelligence trade for this evening in earnest. And the only other thing to remember is, remember folks, this is not old news. This is exactly what the allegations are of what's going on right now in Nicaragua. And indeed, as we mentioned, Ed Wilson ties into the, quote, company because of his involvement with the theft of weapons from China Lake, which is where the, quote, company's weapons came from. Because Ed Wilson and his milieu are all involved with the Iran-Contra scam as well. So this is as real and as fresh as this morning's papers, tomorrow morning's papers.
Now, we're going to pick up basically where we left off at the end of the discussion of the assassination of Judge John Wood by, quote, the company, an arms for drug smuggling ring which appears to have certain connections to the U.S. intelligence community, certainly involves many of the same elements. There was an article in an underground paper, a now defunct underground paper called the Soho News in New York, which maintained that there were some links between the company, quote-unquote, and the Nugan Bank. Unfortunately, that too is buried somewhere deep in our archives, and we don't have that on tape, regrettably. But bear in mind Charles Harrelson's statement that renegade or rogue U.S. agents had Judge John Wood assassinated because he had information that would have proved that the Drug Enforcement Administration imported 95% of the drugs into this country. And as Nip indicated, with the current administration making a very public show of their alleged drug enforcement policies, and with people ranging from train engineers to airplane pilots to professional athletes having to undergo, and amateur athletes as well, having to go rigorous drug testing. That's a possibility that's worth thinking about. Now, the role of the Drug Enforcement Administration as a drug enforcement agency, rather, as an adjunct to the CIA and as a major element in the narcotics traffic itself is going to be the focus of our broadcast this evening. We're going to begin by taking up with a book that is going to provide the information for the bulk of the rest of our broadcast, and specifically we're going to take up with a section of that book that we dealt with at the end of our last program, Radio Free America number 25. The book is called The Great Heroin Coup, subtitled Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. It's authored by freelance Danish journalist Henrik Kruger, Kruger, published in softcover by the South End Press, copyrighted 1980, and with an excellent foreword by Berkeley researcher Peter Dale Scott. In a chapter that we read from last time called, appropriately enough, Guns for Drugs, detailing the interrelationship between the activities of Robert Vesco, Mitchell Werbel, the late U.S. intelligence agent and special operations specialist, and Santos Trafficante, the aforementioned mafioso and associate of U.S. intelligence agency, who may very well have had a role in the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, as we looked at the conclusion of our broadcast last time, Radio Free America number 25, author Jim Hogan put forth a scenario whereby Robert Vesco, Santos Trafficante, and Mitch Werbel were going to use the profits from the narcotics traffic to, among other things, help finance the production of machine guns in Latin America, and in turn use those machine guns and the drug profits to finance anti-communist death squads and terror groups in Latin America. We're going to pick up with a section of the article, of that chapter that we dealt with last time, and specifically this is going to deal with some information implicating the DEA, once again, in not only the narcotics traffic, but in harassing and threatening to murder people who were exposing their involvement or alleged involvement in the narcotics traffic. Reading now from the chapter Guns for Drugs, from The Great Heroin Coup by Henrik Kruger. IOS here, by the way, is Investors Overseas Services, a company that Robert Vesco ran in partnership with a fellow named Bernard Kornfeld. The fugitive IOS billionaire Vesco employed a large contingent of Cuban exiles in his Costa Rica sanctuary. Moreover, his weapons negotiations coincided with the efforts of the fanatic anti-Castro Cuban leader Orlando Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, to assemble Cuban exile groups into an army of terror, CORU, C-O-R-U, that would later carry out assassinations and other dirty work for several Latin American regimes. During Bosch's 1974 and 75 drive, a wave of murder struck Miami's Cuban exile haven. Most victims had been opposed to Bosch. With the obstacles to his plan removed, CORU was established in June of 1976. While Vesco and Werbel were hatching their weapons deal, Bosch's base of operation just happened to be Vesco's kingdom of Costa Rica, and Mafia heroin boss Santos Trafficante Jr. was also reportedly there between January of 1974 and the summer of 1975. Journalist Jim Hogan speculates in his book Spooks that the three might have joined forces in a CIA conspiracy to escalate anti-communist terror in Latin America. In 1973, some of the details began to surface in a series of scandals linking these individuals. DEA undercover agent Frank Peroff, P-E-R-O-F-F, charged Vesco with financing extensive heroin smuggling. For his initiative, Peroff was fired summarily and his life was threatened. Before the Senate Investigation Subcommittee could probe deeply, the case was squelched through the intervention of the White House. The Oval Office had already helped Vesco, a friend of the Nixon family, in his run-in with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which had sought his prosecution for the trail of the swindle he had left in the world of international finance. Midway through the subcommittee investigation of the heroin charges, the DEA announced the disappearance of its Vesco file. By the way, you can read about the misadventures of Frank Peroff in a book called Peroff by H.L. Whittemore. It's an excellent book, and I recommend it to anyone who would like to investigate it. Once again here, we have allegations, and allegations which at least circumstantially appear to be true, of the DEA's collaboration with drug smugglers, and of course that's exactly what Charles Harrelson was charging.
Indeed, and before I go on to the next segment, was this the time when William Casey was involved with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the time of this Vesco inquiry?
He was the head of it. He was the head of it at this time.
That's rather interesting.
He's, of course, now the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, although I don't know, and it remains to be seen how much of a head he has left after his alleged brain cancer.
Indeed.
And what we're going to be dealing with now for the rest of the broadcast is a scenario developed by journalist Henrik Kruger, whereby the Drug Enforcement Administration, and specifically an alleged anti-drug dealer assassination team put together of alleged former CIA agents. Well, basically, Kruger is suggesting that rather than seeking to eliminate the drug traffic through this wave of assassinations, they were seeking to eliminate the Corsican mob, the Corsican syndicate, the Union Corse competition to the Sicilian and Lansky syndicate heroin traffic. Now, what basically Kruger is maintaining is that Richard Nixon, with his many documented ties not only to the Lansky and Sicilian organized crime syndicates, but also to the narcotics traffic, and we took a look at his setting up his lobbying as a lawyer for Pepsi-Cola and establishment of a Pepsi plant, which turned out to be one of the largest heroin refineries in Southeast Asia. We looked at that in RFA number 24, but Richard Nixon's connections to organized crime are a matter of public record, and they are deep and they are extensive. And by way of looking at our discussion this evening, and by way of introducing our discussion, I should say, and taking a look at Kruger's thesis that, in fact, the White House and DEA assassination teams were used to corral the narcotics traffic, not to suppress it, we're going to begin by taking a look at Richard Nixon's connections to organized crime and some of the organized crime and intelligence elements that figure so prominently in our story this evening and throughout the course of our investigation into the involvement of the intelligence services in the narcotics traffic.
Reading further from Henrik Kruger's Great Heroin Coup. Richard Nixon's connections to the syndicate and its stooges are a matter of record. The only question is when they began. Some say it was 1946 when Nixon ran for Congress in California and Murray Chotiner, Chotiner, a top syndicate defense attorney, ran his campaign with support from the gangster Mickey Cohen. Others placed the Nixon underworld wedding as early as 1943, when Nixon was working in the Office of Price Administration at a desk responsible for controlling the market in rubber goods. There he allegedly met his future pals George, quote, the senator from Cuba, Smathers, and the Cuban-American B.B. Rebozo, who later struck it rich in real estate. The two were then small-time. Smathers, a lawyer for a syndicate front smuggling auto tires from Cuba, Rebozo, the owner of a gas station that sold the tires. The Florida clique was a happy family. Nixon liked to take fishing jaunts with the likes of Rebozo, Meyer Lansky's associate Tatum Chubby Wofford, and Richard Danner, who would later manage the Sands Casino in Las Vegas for Howard Hughes. He also got to know people even closer to the syndicate, who had extensive interests in Cuba. In 1952, one short month after the dictator Batista's comeback, Nixon and Danner joined throngs of tourists who unloaded their savings at one of the syndicate's Cuban casinos. Nixon would return frequently. He, Rebozo, and Smathers allegedly invested in the island during the 1950s, and in 1955, as Vice President of the United States, Nixon would pin an award on Batista, with whom he was photographed in the dictator's palace. Nixon also helped plan the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1959. Chairing the 5412 Group, a National Security Council subcommittee in charge of covert actions, the Vice President pushed for the plan's approval before his 1960 presidential race against John F. Kennedy. According to Howard Hunt, Nixon was the invasion's, quote, secret action officer in the White House. President Eisenhower, who would later plead ignorance of the plan's extent, assumed it was limited to support for anti-Castro guerrillas in the mountains. When JFK took over the Oval Office, he was presented with a fait accompli. If Eisenhower was really left out in the cold on the plan's magnitude, then William Pauley must have been among Nixon's co-conspirators. As mentioned earlier, Pauley talked Eisenhower into arming the anti-communist Cubans. Pauley, spelled P-A-W-L-E-Y, was and would remain one of Nixon's most ardent supporters. When the invasion proved a bust, Nixon's voice was among the loudest, accusing Kennedy of undermining it by refusing reinforcements. In the years that had followed, he continued to cultivate support among the Cuban exiles and other right-wing constituencies. Cubans for Nixon and Asians for Nixon touted him as a man who would not forsake the cause of anti-communism. The Nixon of near-hysterical anti-communism would win additional allies in the syndicate and in the powerful business circles tied in with the military and espionage. Fortunately for Nixon, forces behind the above lobbies were also influential in organized labor, especially the Teamsters Union. Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa became a pawn of the Lansky Syndicate, which borrowed millions from the union's pension fund. However, Hoffa's obsequiousness towards the mob was dampened by Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aggressive investigation of Teamster policies. In 1967, prior to Nixon's decisive electoral campaign, Hoffa landed in jail with a 13-year sentence for misuse of union funds. The new Teamster strongmen, Frank Fitzsimmons and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, were friends of Nixon and in the hands of the syndicate. When Nixon pardoned Hoffa just prior to Christmas 1971, Hoffa had to promise to stay out of organized labor. In the 60s, Nixon grew even closer to his friends in Miami, who by then had made millions in land speculation. Dade County, north of Miami, became known as Lanskyville, as a string of seemingly legitimate real estate firms handled the Lansky mob's enormous holdings. Among the more prominent firms were the following:
The Cape Florida Development Company, run by Donald Berg, B.E.R.G., and Nixon's pal Rebozo. The two worked closely with Al Polizzi, P-O-L-I-Z-Z-I, the former head of the syndicate's Mayfield Road gang in Cleveland, then in charge of the syndicate's Florida contractors. An investigation into the placement of stolen securities at Rebozo's bank was nipped in the bud. The Mary Carter Paint Company, which in 1967 became Resorts International, that now runs the world's most profitable casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and was purportedly the brainchild of Mr. Lansky. Resorts Paradise Island Casino in the Bahamas was managed by Ed Cellini, C-E-L-L-I-N-I, a long-time Lansky casino operator. The General Development Corporation, run by two Lansky strawmen, Wallace Groves and Lou Chesler, C-H-E-S-L-E-R. Its board of directors included Lansky broker Max Orovitz, O-R-O-V-I-T-Z, and the gangster trigger Mike Coppola. Groves bought up half of Grand Bahama Island for the syndicate and contracted with Nixon's law client National Bulk Carriers to construct a harbor there. The Major Realty Company, whose controlling shareholders were Senator Smathers and Lansky's men Orovitz and Ben Siegelbaum. Through his friends, Nixon acquired land on Key Biscayne and Fisher's Island off the Florida coast. In return, he readily made himself available for personal appearances. When Mary Carter in 1967 opened the Nassau Bay Club Casino on Grand Bahama Island, Nixon was the guest of honor. 1 year later, he was there when Resorts International opened its casino on Paradise Island. Nixon also expressed his friendship in other ways. Hoffa was not the only one who did not have to pay his full debt to society. Neither did Leonard Bursten, B-U-R-S-T-E-N, Carl Covens, K-O-V-E-N-S, or Morris Schenker, S-H-E-N-K-E-R, all syndicate associates, the last two solid Nixon campaign supporters. Robert Morgenthau, the federal attorney for the Southern District of New York, became interested in some of Nixon's friends in 1968. He proved Max Orovitz guilty of willful violation of stock registration laws and was investigating syndicate money transfers to Switzerland. The latter threatened to lead to an indictment of Nixon's friend, John M. King of Investors Overseas Services. Morgenthau, however, was removed from office.
Continuing with the great heroin coup. Glancing at major contributors to Nixon's 1968 and 1972 campaign chests, one finds the names of Miami strawman Lou Chesler and Richard Pistell, P-I-S-T-E-L-L, Resorts President James Crosby, and John M. King, the Texas billionaire Howard Hughes, master swindler Robert Vesco, and the California millionaire C. Arnholt Smith, a close associate of the gangster John Alessio, and later convicted of misuse of bank funds. The list of Nixon's major personal and political supporters starts with Rebozo, Smathers, Dewey, Hoffa, and Frank Fitzsimmons, all with their syndicate associations, and goes on to include William Pauley and the China lobby's Madame Anna Chan Chennault. Nearly all of Nixon's major supporters in Florida were involved in one way or another in the Bay of Pigs operation. The same can be said of the top syndicate figures, 4 of whom escorted the invasion force in a yacht for part of the voyage, while Traficante's lieutenants in Miami and the Dominican Republic stood ready to seize the casinos. Let me just pop in here real quickly. That's, of course, Santos Traficante, who we've been talking about earlier, the Florida mafia chieftain. Moreover, one cannot overlook Nixon's particular connection to iOS multimillionaire Vesco, who until recently was in exile in Costa Rica, where he allegedly financed the smuggling of narcotics. Vesco provided covert financial aid to Nixon's re-election campaign and was closely associated with Nixon's brother Edward and nephew Donald Jr. Richard Nixon himself is alleged to have met secretly with Vesco in Salzburg, Austria. The White House finally came to Vesco's aid in a case brought against him by the Securities and Exchange Commission, just as an investigation of his narcotics activities was similarly choked off. Okay, so in this long segment, we've got a lot of stuff. The basic thing we're talking about here, although, again, you will notice that some of these people are still players today, whether if they are the organizations, the Traficante organization, others still in existence, or, as we mentioned earlier here, the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation choked off by orders of the White House into Vesco's illegal dealings, of course, and as we mentioned a moment ago, William Casey was head of the Securities and Exchange Commission at that time, and of course now, among other things, he is the head of the CIA, the putative head at this point. Now, the main thing here that we're noticing, though, is the fact that it looks like very early on in his administration, or in his career, rather, that Richard Nixon was, in effect, tapped on the shoulder by the Lansky mob and other syndicate figures and was told, "You're our boy, Dick," just in the way that George Smathers became the senator from Cuba and had massive help in becoming a Florida senator from the Florida syndicate. Richard Nixon, all throughout his career, had key help, financial and otherwise, from the mob, the Lansky mob among others, and you can see going back to at least 1946, if not 1943, when he was just a guy playing poker in the Navy.
Now, again, the involvement of Richard Nixon throughout his political career with organized crime elements, and in particular with the anti-Castro Cuban exile community, is worth noting. Also, by the way, his connections to the China lobby and its powerful narcotics connections. We discussed the Bay of Pigs in a number of broadcasts, of course, in our Radio Free America shows, or in our Guns of November shows, rather, numbers 1 and 2 in particular. We talked about some of the anti-Castro Cubans and their relationship to the Bay of Pigs. It's also worth noting, too, that in Radio Free America number 12, we went into what we call the Cuban Freikorps at great length. We talked about the whole Bay of Pigs in Operation 40 at considerable length there. Once again, the anti-Castro Cubans from the Bay of Pigs have been front and center in the recent Iran-Contra-gate that we are going to be covering at some point in the not-too-distant future in a Radio Free America series. And again, narcotics trafficking is front and center in the background of, or not in the background, in the foreground of that case as well. We took a look at Richard Nixon and his connections, again, to the Bay of Pigs and the U.S. intelligence apparatus in relation to the Bay of Pigs. And that's that and the Nixon's Lansky connections, and also, again, the China lobby connections are worth noting here, because what we're going to be examining is Kruger's thesis that basically the federal intelligence apparatus and the drug enforcement apparatus were used by the Nixon White House to corral the international heroin traffic for Nixon's mob and anti-Castro Cuban buddies. And that, of course, is consistent with the allegations made not only by Charles Harrelson, but also by L.H. Whittemore and former DEA agent Frank Peroff, that in fact the DEA is involved in the narcotics traffic, not in helping to suppress the narcotics traffic.
And again, it cannot be stressed too strongly. Now, we have examined fairly recently, and we'll be examining in some depth tonight, some of the involvement with the anti-Castro Cubans and their involvement in the milieu, and then the same circles that they run in we'll be looking at in later broadcasts, Radio Free America broadcasts on this subject, as we begin to get into Klaus Barbie's Coca Fascista network and others running up out of Latin America. But since we haven't discussed it in depth tonight, we might want to go back real quickly and look at the China lobby. For those not familiar with those, just to briefly reiterate a couple of things. The China lobby, of course, has become is a slang term for the group of people who were either literally supporters of Chiang Kai-shek in China at the time that the Chiang Kai-shek government, always suspect at the best of times, crumbled utterly during the Chinese Revolution, and they were forced out and wound up in Taiwan. But besides that, there was also a large American contingent of supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, and we've talked about it at some great length, and out of the American supporters of Chiang Kai-shek sprang such things as the John Birch Society, and the Anna Chennault mentioned here was the wife of General Claire Chennault, U.S. Army Air Corps, who was himself a good buddy and confidant of Chiang Kai-shek. Now, at the time that the Chiang Kai-shek government fell, large quantities of his soldiers fled across the border of China into various Southeast Asian countries, and it was at the time that they were a rogue army on the loose in Southeast Asia that the next connection between Chiang Kai-shek and the China lobby and the drug trade come into effect.
Well, yeah, it's worth noting that Chiang Kai-shek had been heavily involved with the narcotics traffic through a fellow by the name of General Ille. Ille, in turn, who was described sort of as Chiang Kai-shek's Himmler. He basically was Chiang Kai-shek's intelligence and internal security chief. The bulk of his organization was provided by a Shanghai narcotics and organized crime syndicate called the Green Gang, headed by a man named Tu Yue Sheng, so that, in essence, Chiang Kai-shek's national security apparatus was inseparable from the narcotics traffic in that part of the world. And in the United States, the China lobby here became heavily involved through people like General Albert Wiedemeyer and others with Chiang Kai-shek. Now, in Southeast Asia, the China lobby, not only in the Golden Triangle through the Kuomintang, but also eventually through representatives of the China lobby that got involved, that participated pivotally in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, helped to bring the narcotics into the United States. Again, in Radio Free America number 24, we covered the evolution of the narcotics traffic in Southeast Asia at great length and the pivotal involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency in it. Now, it's worth noting also that as we looked at in Radio Free America number 24, the growth not only of the Sicilian mobs and the American syndicates' involvement in narcotics traffic, but also that of the Corsican syndicate themselves, the Union Corse, were spurred greatly by the Central Intelligence Agency, which used both organizations, as an anti-Castro cadre, an anti-communist cadre in that part of the world. So that the original involvement of people like Lucky Luciano and the various Corsican gangsters, so some of whom we're going to look at in our next Radio Free America, stems directly from their role as anti-Castro, anti-communist guerrillas for the Central Intelligence Agency. But the China lobby and their minions in Vietnam and the Kuomintang involvement in Burma, in Thailand, in the so-called Golden Triangle, and the long-standing involvement of Chiang Kai-shek's forces in the narcotics traffic are front and center here. One of the things we looked at in Radio Free America number 12, the third of our Aryan Nation series, was the evolution of elements of the China lobby into the Cuba lobby. The aforementioned William Pauley, mentioned in the chapter we just read, was a key figure who was involved with the China lobby, and then became one of the most vociferous advocates of Operation 40, the series of guerrilla raids carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency against Fidel Castro. It's worth noting, too, that we took a look at the involvement of members of the China lobby with the Aryan Nations milieu that we looked at in our Aryan Nations series. We took a look at Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group and how their name was adopted by a proposed assassination squad run by Nelson Bunker Hunt, or financed by Nelson Bunker Hunt, in Texas, and elsewhere. So the China lobby is inseparable from the things that we're looking at here, and in turn, elements of the China lobby, one of the things we looked at in Radio Free America number 11 was the involvement of China lobby figures in the assassination of President Kennedy. So again, the Kennedy assassination is one of the things which looms very, very large in the background of what we're talking about. Elements of the China lobby, and in turn, the China lobby's evolution from the MacArthur group that we looked at, the involvement of anti-Castro Cubans, the involvement of many of the members of the syndicate such as Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and others, or probable involvement in the Kennedy assassination should not be overlooked here. One of the things that we should stress, perhaps with regard to the material that we're reading from Henry Kruger, we're going to try and spell as many of the names for you as we can, because some listeners have expressed confusion about how some of the names were spelled. But beyond that, we're not going to be able to go over every detail, to put it mildly, in these chapters. Kruger is a very, very dense writer. There are an awful lot of names and events that are going to crop up here. We are just not going to be in a position to stop and analyze every single one. So bear with us as best you can, because Kruger's the pace he sets here is unmerciful, and you're going to hear an awful lot of names, and we're just not going to be able to go over every one of them in the detail that we might like. So we're going to proceed now with the establishment by the Nixon White House of basically an assassination squad, which eventually came under not only the supervision of the Nixon White House, but also the DEA, that was initially or allegedly supposed to eliminate major narcotics traffickers. In fact, it appears that what it was used to do was to eliminate the competition of Nixon's organized crime and intelligence associates for control of the narcotics traffic. We're going to take a look at Kruger's thesis that is in fact what they were doing in a little bit. Returning again to Henry Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup, in a chapter called White House Hanky-Panky. Never had Richard Nixon's White House staff been so preoccupied with narcotics matters as in the summer of 1971. They were obsessed with two projects: a new White House intelligence and enforcement unit as envisioned by the Houston Plan, and a comprehensive narcotics control apparatus similarly under direct presidential control. The two idées fixées converged in a conspiratorial and political criminal network of hitherto unimagined dimensions. That summer, the White House set up the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention alongside the Special Investigation Unit, otherwise known as the Plumbers. Several of the Plumbers also worked on narcotics affairs. The group's key figures included Egil Krogh, Krogh, chief plumber, who followed John Ehrlichman, for whose law firm he had worked part-time, to the White House in 1968, within months of his graduation from the University of Washington Law School. He was named Deputy Assistant to the President for Law Enforcement, and within 3 years found himself in charge of both Nixon's narcotics and law enforcement campaign, and of the Plumbers Squad. His single-minded ambition surfaced in a declaration to the noted psychiatrist and narcotics expert, Dr. Daniel S. Friedman, when the latter refused to support one of Krogh's programs. Quote, "Well, don't worry. Anyone who opposes us will destroy. As a matter of fact, anyone who doesn't support us will destroy." Krogh would wind up in jail for the break-in at the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Lewis Fielding. Walter Minnick, M-I-N-N-I-C-K, temporary plumber, a young graduate of Harvard Business School and a former agent of the CIA, who joined Krogh's narcotics staff in the spring of 1971 and later helped draft the reorganization plan that created the DEA. John Caulfield, plumber, a former agent of the New York City Police Department's Bureau of Special Services, which specialized in narcotics and, quote, monitoring the activities of terrorist organizations, unquote. In the 1960 presidential campaign, he had been assigned to protect candidate Nixon in New York City. That and his close relationship with Nixon's personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, of 18-and-1/2-minute tape gap fame, gained him a foot in the door of the White House. Miles Ambrose, the former customs commissioner who was named head of the narcotics campaign's domestic strike force, he would later leave government service in disgrace. I would interrupt here that Miles Ambrose also represented the Rajneeshpuram organization in their recent difficulties, and a program about Rajneeshpuram, that a regular One Step Beyond program, is on permanent file at DAVCOR if you'd like to look at it, or listen to it, I should say. Continuing with Kruger's account here. And many of the people whose involvement both with, that he names as being involved both with narcotics enforcement and with Nixon's plumbers unit, that was the group which affected the Watergate break-in and precipitated the Watergate situation, or at least that aspect of it which appeared on the surface to the general public. G. Gordon Liddy, plumber, a former FBI agent whose narcotics intelligence job at the Treasury Department had been terminated only weeks prior to his recruitment by the White House for his outspoken lobbying against gun control legislation. Eventually, he would get 6 to 20 for his role in the break-in at the Watergate complex and 1 to 3 for the job at Fielding's office. Howard Hunt, plumber, a former CIA agent closely connected to the agency-trained Cuban exiles, many of whom had emerged from Santo Traficante's Cuban narcotics mafia. Hunt was employed as a special advisor on narcotics problems in Southeast Asia. In November of 1973, Judge John Sirica would sentence him to 2.5 to 8 years, reduced from an initial 35 for the Watergate break-in. Lucien Conein, C-O-N-E-I-N, a CIA agent, Ed Lansdale's right-hand man in Vietnam, and an expert on Southeast Asian narcotics centers in the Corsican Mafia. He was brought into the White House by his old buddy Hunt. David Young, a plumber, a young lawyer who put up a sign outside his office, Mr. Young, plumber, when apprised that he would be plugging leaks and that the trade had run in his family. He came to Crow's staff from Henry Kissinger's National Security Council. And I would just say that at broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC, Los Altos Hills.
Continuing with the great heroin coup. It was a strange mix of novices and experienced agents with the most intriguing pasts. Hunt and Liddy were located in room 16 of the Executive Office Building, headquarters for the Plumbers Group's secret narcotics missions and other crooked operations on behalf of the Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP. The Plumbers' first assignment was the break-in at the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. For the break-in dirty work, Hunt enlisted Bernard Barker, Eugenio Rolando Martinez, and Felipe de Diego, 3 of his Cuban friends who had been involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Martinez and de Diego also took part in the CIA's follow-up Operation 40, and the ubiquitous Martinez was in on Traficante masterminded boat raids on Cuba. By the summer of 1971, the White House death squad was well on its way. Hunt sought out Barker in Miami for what Hunt called a, quote, new national security organization above the CIA and FBI. Barker would assemble a force of 120 CIA-trained exiles for Operation Diamond, which, under cover of narcotics enforcement, would kidnap or assassinate political enemies. Barker signed up. In the fall of 1971, Hunt asked another one of his Cuban friends, Bay of Pigs veteran Manuel Artime, spelled A-R-T-I-M-E, to set up, quote, hit teams for the liquidation of narcotics dealers. As later revealed, Artime's primary target was to have been the Panamanian strongman General Omar Torrijos. Crow and his staff, meanwhile, tightened their grip on narcotics control. After the BNDD takeover, that's, by the way, is the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, after the BNDD takeover of Customs International Jurisdiction, Crow pushed Bureau Chief John Ingersoll for results to feed Congress and the press. In September 1971, Crow was named to direct the newly formed Cabinet Committee on International Narcotics Control. In collaboration with the State Department, BNDD, CIA, and Henry Kissinger's office, the committee coordinated the international struggle against narcotics. State Department Narcotics Advisor Nelson Gross, chosen to supervise the joint actions, was later sentenced to 2 years for attempted bribery and income tax evasion. Egil Crow was less than satisfied with existing narcotics efforts, especially those of the CIA, whose intelligence reports, according to Ingersoll, were decisive for the work of the BNDD. Crow wanted the White House instead to handle the BNDD's intelligence work. Nixon's staff would then decide which drug traffickers to pursue. Crow's dissatisfaction was expressed to Hunt, who immediately proposed an Office of National Narcotics Intelligence, ONNI, where all narcotics intelligence reports would be analyzed and follow-up actions decided. Hunt told Crow he could enlist for the office experienced CIA figures, starting with Lucien Conein at its head. Nixon, however, chose William C. Sullivan instead. Once second to J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI, Sullivan had managed Division 5, which investigated espionage, sabotage, and subversion. He also directed Operation COINTELPRO, the Bureau's vendetta against dissident political and cultural groups such as the Black Panthers, and had been Nixon's choice to direct the Houston Plan's elaborate surveillance of U.S. citizens. Houston in this case spelled Huston. Hunt nevertheless found a niche for his friend. Conein was assigned to the BNDD as a, quote, strategic intelligence officer and came to control overseas narcotics intelligence, originally the domain of ONNI, while Sullivan
concentrated on domestic affairs. Incidentally, the Houston Plan was an abortive plan developed by the Nixon White House in which all U.S. intelligence activities would be combined into a single giant U.S. intelligence agency, rather than the various different agencies that we have now, such as the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and others. Continuing with the Great Heroin Coup. The White House now controlled narcotics intelligence at home and abroad, but that still wasn't enough. Nixon's staff also sought to control enforcement itself, and that required effective strike forces. In January of 1972, the White House set up the Office for Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, ODALE, according to a plan conceived by Gordon Liddy. It became the domestic strike force under Miles Ambrose, whose government career ended with news of his pleasure trip to the ranch of a Texan indicted for narcotics and gun running. ODLE soon became notorious for its record of illegal raids, no-knock entries into private homes, and beatings of innocent people. Some called it the American Gestapo. Overseas as well, the White House was dissatisfied with the BNDD's enforcement powers. Dr. J. Thomas Ungerleider, Ungerleider, a member of the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, noted in a record of his conversations with BNDD officials, quote, "There was some talk about establishing hit squads, assassination teams, as they are said to have in a South American country." I'm going to read that sentence again. "There was some talk about establishing hit squads, assassination teams, as they are said to have in a South American country. It was stated that with 150 key assassinations, the entire heroin refining operation can be thrown into chaos. Officials say it is known exactly who is involved in these operations, but can't prove it." Hunt, Liddy, and others in Room 16 did not confine themselves to narcotics campaigns and political assassinations. On behalf of CREEP, that's the Committee to Re-elect the President, they raised campaign funds from more or less shady sources and sabotaged the campaigns of George Wallace, Hubert Humphrey, Edmund Muskie, and George McGovern. Hunt's CIA colleagues are among those who suspect he spiked Muskie's lemonade with an LSD-like substance prior to the candidate's famous tearful speech. Besides Hunt's Cubans, the familiar Frank Sturgis, who had earlier taken orders from Santo Trafficante, took on narcotics work and special assignments for CREEP. According to a 1972 FBI report, sources in Miami had claimed Sturgis was then associated with organized crime activities. He later told an interviewer that he had aided Hunt in a 1971 investigation of the drug traffic reaching the U.S. from Paraguay via Panama. He was in on several actions connected with the investigation, which focused exclusively on Auguste Ricor's Grupo Francais. Interrupting, Auguste Ricor is a Corsican gangster and Nazi collaborator who ran a very, very important drug smuggling ring. We're going to talk about that in our next broadcast. Sturgis was everywhere in the hectic spring of 1972. In May, he was among the men who assaulted Daniel Ellsberg on the steps of the Capitol. Later that month, he and Cubans, including Bernard Barker, arranged a Miami demonstration in support of Nixon's decision to mine Haiphong Harbor. Sturgis himself was at the wheel of the truck leading the procession. He helped recruit agitators to disrupt the Democratic National Convention, and in the June 17th Watergate break-in, Sturgis joined CIA, Trafficante Cubans, and White House narcotics conspirators. As the noted Berkeley researcher Peter Dale Scott put it in 1973, quote, "In my opinion, it is no coincidence that the key figures in Watergate, Liddy, Hunt, Sturgis, Crow, and Caulfield, had been drawn from the conspiratorial world of government narcotics enforcement, a shady realm in which operations of organized crime, counter-revolution and government intelligence have traditionally overlapped.
I'm going to try again. Continuing with Henrik Kruger's great heroin coup. In July 1973, Nixon's narcotic forces were essentially consolidated according to Reorganization Plan No. 2 worked out by former CIA agent Walter Minnick, remember that's M-I-N-N-I-C-K, and Egil Crow. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was formed out of the BNDD, the ODALE, ONNI, and Customs Intelligence. 4,000 operatives, including 50 CIA agents, many of them Cubans from the ODALE hardcore, 500 customs agents, and most of the BNDD staff made the DEA a powerful new agency. Ingersoll of the BNDD, Ambrose of ODALE, and Sullivan of the ONNI all resigned as John R. Bartels, B-A-R-T-E-L-S, became the DEA's first director. His was no small task. Earlier rivalries persisted. The strange brew of agents with widely varying backgrounds and assignments made the DEA difficult, if not impossible, to steer. U.S. narcotics enforcement has a history of corruption, scandal, and exposure of agent collaboration with the criminals it has been assigned to police. Still, no bureau has been as plagued by scandal as the DEA has in 7 years of existence. And of course, this was written in 1979. Let me read that one more time. Still, no bureau has been as plagued by scandal as the DEA has in 7 years of existence. The exposés and charges run the gamut from trafficking in drugs, teamwork with the mob, and protection of major traffickers, to thievery, gun-running, torture, and assassination of drug traffickers. When Lucien Conein became the head of the DEA's Special Operations Branch, he allegedly carried out an assassination program after setting up the DEA's Special Operations Group, DEASOG, under cover of the B.R. Fox Company, and housed on Connecticut Avenue in Washington. DEASOG's 12 members, the Dirty Dozen, were hard and experienced Latino CIA agents transferred over to the drug agency for the occasion. Prior to DEASOG, Conein had set up another DEA, quote, intelligence operation, Deacon 1, employing Cuban exile veterans of CIA training camps who were supervised by 30 other Cubans, all formerly of the CIA's clandestine services. In response to the claim that DEASOG was a, quote, hit team, Conein told journalist George Cryle, quote, that is a big blank lie. That is bull blank. However, a DEA official had told Cryle, quote, when you get down to it, Conein was organizing an assassination program. He was frustrated by the big-time operators who were just too insulated to get to, unquote. DEA officials also told Cryle that, quote, meetings were held to decide whom to target and what method of assassination to employ. Conein then assigned the task to 3 of the former CIA operatives assigned to the Connecticut Avenue safe house.
DSOG shared its Washington office with an old friend and colleague of Hunt and Conein's from OSS China, the weapons-dealing soldier of fortune and specialist in assassination, Mitch Wirbel III. Wirbel told Cryle he had been a business partner of Conein's as late as 1974, and that he and Conein had worked together on providing the DEA with assassination devices. Among Wirbel's other associates were Frank Sturgis, Cuban exile leaders, and Robert Vesco, who, like Wirbel himself, had been charged with bankrolling narcotics smuggling. Carlos Hernandez Rumbaut, R-U-M-B-A-U-T, the bodyguard of Vesco's close friend and business partner, former Costa Rican President Pepe Figueres, F-I-G-U-E-R-E-S, is a former Conein agent who fled the country to avoid imprisonment on a drug conviction. He has reportedly re-entered the U.S. twice with a U.S. diplomatic passport. Assassination, it can be argued, became a modus operandi under Richard Nixon. The CIA carried out assassination and extermination campaigns in Vietnam, Guatemala, Argentina, and Brazil, aided in Latin America by the local death squads. The White House appears to have sponsored a secret assassination program under cover of drug enforcement. I'm going to read that last sentence again. The White House appears to have sponsored a secret assassination program under cover of drug enforcement. It was continued by the DEA, which seemingly overlapped with the CIA in political rather than drug enforcement. Until 1974, the training of torturers and members of Latin American death squads came under the auspices of the CIA and USAID's Office of Public Safety. Some 100,000 Brazilian policemen, for example, were trained, and 523 of them were chosen for courses in the USA. They were trained at the International Police Academy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., and at a secret CIA center in the same city on R Street, under cover of International Police Services Incorporated. When school was out, the prize pupils returned home to work, besides CIA advisors, as functionaries or torturers in such effective repression apparatuses as São Paulo's Operação Bandeirantes, OPERACIU-BANDEIRANTES. Many would moonlight with the death squads. After Tupamaro's guerrillas kidnapped and killed U.S. police advisor Dan Mitrione in Uruguay, Washington's School for Funding for Foreign Police came into the limelight, and Congress cut off their funding. Nonetheless, the training program and direct assistance and supervision continued. A 1976 investigation authorized by Senator James Abourezk revealed that the U.S. torture academies had not in fact been completely closed down. According to Jack Anderson, Abourezk found such a school had been in operation since 1974 in Los Fresnos, Texas, at the site of a former bomb school. Another journalist, William Hoffman, later confirmed the existence of a school for torture in Los Fresnos, which had since moved to Georgia, where it was known as the Law Enforcement Training Center. Interestingly, Conin's friend Werbel runs his own large training center in Georgia, the Farm. It's used for, among other things, the training of law enforcement officers.
Continuing. Much of the old police support apparatus was simply transferred to AID's International Narcotic Control Program. By the way, AID is Aid for International Development. AID's International Narcotics Control Program, otherwise known as INC, which really spelled DEA. In 1974, the DEA had some 400 agents in Latin America, or roughly the number of advisors recalled from the OPS program. INC's budget for technical equipment abroad, meanwhile, jumped from $2.2 million in 1973 to $12.5 million in 1974. The politics of the new drug effort were exposed when, in 1974, the man behind Argentina's death squad, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, Social Minister Lopez Rega, that's Jose Lopez Rega, we've talked about him a lot, last name Rega, R-E-G-A, appeared on TV with U.S. Ambassador Robert C. Hill to publicize the two nations' anti-narcotics collaboration with the words, quote, "Guerrillas are the main users of drugs in Argentina." That's, of course, G-U-E-R, guerrillas. Guerrillas are the main users of drugs in Argentina, therefore the anti-drug campaign will automatically be an anti-guerrilla campaign as well, unquote. It is striking how close the various extermination and repression campaigns have been to the narcotics traffic. The Mayo Army, deployed by the CIA in Laos, smuggled large quantities of opium. Lopez Rega and his Argentine AAA henchmen were eventually exposed as keys to a cocaine ring. One of the chief AAA hatchet men, Francois Chiappe, was a lieutenant in the Record David heroin network. Cutting in, by the way, Dave already mentioned Auguste Record, and Christian David was an affiliate of his who also had links to various Western intelligence agencies, notably France and the United States. Paraguay's most ruthless high-ranking officers were exposed as heroin profiteers. Christian David took part in extermination campaigns in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Operação Bandeirantes chief Sergio Fleury and several of his colleagues pocketed large protection payoffs. Fleury's number 2 man in the Sao Paulo death squad, Amer Augusto de Oliveira, alias Fininho, fled to Paraguay after he was charged with murder. There, under the name Irineu Bruno da Silva, he worked for the Record gang. I'm going to give you that guy's name real quickly and spell them for you. First is Operação Bandeirantes Chief Sergio Fleury, F-L-E-U-R-Y. Fleury's number 2 man in the death squad in Sao Paulo was Amer Augusto de Oliveira, alias Fininho. I don't need to spell that for you. Fled to Paraguay, there under the name Irineu Bruno da Silva. He worked for the Record gang. When David's successor, the Brazilian narcotics dealer Milton Concalves Thiago, spelled Thiago, alias Cabeçal, the brain, was arrested in 1975, it was learned that he had been paying off the entire Rio de Janeiro death squad, which included 4 narcotics police lieutenants. And finally, as we go to press, we learn that the dictator Pinochet assumed control of Chile's cocaine trade, then turned it over to his secret police, DINA, D-I-N-A, which shared the profits with its Cuban exile henchmen. The political violence set in motion by the White House narcotics offices ran smoothly. But what of actual drug enforcement? From its inception, it focused on dismantling the French narcotics network. When that was done, America would be free of the heroin plague, or so said Nixon and his staff. Reports of increasing amounts of heroin from Southeast Asia and Mexico were obscured by the great public relations campaign on the struggle against the Corsicans.
The Turkey-Marseille U.S. heroin pipeline was indeed shut down, and the French Corsican mafia was almost totally decimated. But major new suppliers in Southeast Asia and South America were left untouched, despite warnings and reports, and despite the many CIA experts, unquote, on the Latin American drug scene. Not only were most major heroin suppliers in the 2 regions left alone, they were protected, and they were aided by the arrest of small-time competitors. At home, the story was nearly the same. ODALE and DEA nabbed only minor distributors and sidewalk pushers. Well, that's a mighty long segment to digest here. We're going to take a long musical break so that people can rest, since we've rested their brains, and we'll rest our mouths, and poor Nip can rest his slightly flu-ridden lungs. And then we're going to come back. We're going to recap some of what we've just seen, and we're going to look at Kruger's allegations and analysis of the great heroin coup itself.
So don't go away. Dave Emory, myself, Nip Tuck, and as Dave put it, my slightly flu-ridden lungs will return with more of Radio Free America in just a few moments right here on KFJC. And we are back. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emory in the studios at KFJC. Going back to Radio Free America, we heard the Newport Rebels and a Charles Mingus song, Mysterious Blues. Great song. And after that, there's a specific reason why I played that long choral piece. Those of you out there who are classical music aficionados will recognize the... Get back to the stuff here. We've got lots more to talk about tonight. We're going to be continuing readings from the Great Heroin Coup, and we are going to be following up on the subject of the heroin coup itself, which was the point at which the Nixon White House and their special involvement in the drug trade, how they basically infiltrated the drug trade, how they used the special White House team, the plumbers, much of which also wound up operating in the Watergate case, to lapse over into the founding of the DEA, and in fact made the DEA a de facto murder and enforcement unit, and the Drug Enforcement Administration enforcing almost in the sense of mafia enforcers, to essentially rub out the old French and Turkish and Corsican heroin traffic, and essentially swing it over to the Lansky syndicate coming out of Asia and running through the Lansky holdings in Central America and South America and the Caribbean and up into the United States. So between a rather short period of time during the Nixon administration, this was accomplished, and as we talked about, not the least important factor is that Richard Nixon himself was already strongly connected to organized crime, and the fact that his own administration's previously unseen, something like this had never been seen before, that his administration's dealings in the drug trade should result in a massive windfall for the Lansky syndicate and people who are already involved as organized crime people in helping the Nixon administration pursue their covert political agenda. Again, it stretches coincidence a little bit too far for those of us who have been studying this kind of stuff to believe, in fact, it was coincidence.
Now, again, the important part about the assassination team put together by the Nixon White House under a fellow named Lucien Conein was that most of the people involved in it were not only quote, former CIA agents, but specifically there were very, very strong connections between this group and the anti-Castro Cuban exile community from the Bay of Pigs, which in turn was very much linked to syndicate elements involved and CIA elements involved in the narcotics traffic itself. Beyond that, this alleged anti-narcotics assassination team was heavily involved in the Latin American terror scene. Many of the same elements worked in conjunction with CIA in Latin America. So what we have is the Nixon White House putting together an assassination team allegedly to eliminate the international narcotics traffic. In effect, this assassination team functions as an extension of the U.S. intelligence system. Most of its agents are, quote, former, unquote, intelligence agents who appear to have been simply infiltrated into the DEA or the various Nixon White House drug enforcement bodies, because there were a number of them, in order to not eliminate the narcotics traffic, but to corner it, as we're about to look at, for the Nixon-associated organized crime and intelligence elements which have emerged so prominently in the story of the evolution of the narcotics traffic. We're talking Cuba lobby here, we're talking China lobby, we're talking syndicate, Lansky, and Sicilian. And we're going to take a look now at Henry Kruger's analysis of how this assassination team was employed. We're going to read now the 21st chapter of The Great Heroin Coup by Henry Kruger, called The Coup. Now, as the introductory remarks here are going to indicate, the thesis here that Kruger is developing is hypothetical. I agree with his thesis. I think his information is quite compelling, but he makes it clear that this is his interpretation of the events. The facts we've just laid out in the previous two chapters, here is how Kruger interprets those facts. This chapter contains my personal interpretation of the Great Heroin Coup. Errors are possible on any or all points, inasmuch as the clandestine operations treated in this book transpire in a closed world infested with lies and cover-ups. There will always be loose ends. The coup itself, which transferred control over the heroin gold mine from one part of the world to another, I regard as a fact of life. Similarly, do I regard the involvement of elements of the White House staff. Just how high up it went, the reader can decide for him or herself. Many of the many heretofore mentioned details in the coup's planning and execution, I find the following essential. 1. Prior to the coup, Lansky syndicate narcotics boss Santo Trafficante Jr. had made the necessary arrangements in Southeast Asia and Mexico, and had started a war with the Corsican Mafia. Trafficante's old partner, the CIA, had long since assumed control over Southeast Asia opium smuggling, following Ed Lansdale and Lucien Conin's defeat of the local branch of the Corsican underworld. In 1971, when the coup's execution was seriously underway, Cuban exiles, a group with which Trafficante enjoyed a unique rapport, appeared in the White House's mysterious narcotics operation. They were tied especially to Conin and E. Howard Hunt. Through a succession of bureaucratic reorganizations, the White House assumed control over narcotics intelligence and enforcement. U.S. narcotics officials waged an all-out war against the Corsicans' Turkey-Marseille USA network, while warnings of a serious heroin threat from Southeast Asia were all but dismissed. When the Corsican Mafia was neutralized, the narcotics enforcement apparatus was suddenly reorganized as the DEA, and shortly thereafter, heroin began flowing into the United States from Southeast Asia and Mexico. The CIA-infiltrated DEA grabbed control of Latin America's political repression apparatus, was accused of protecting major narcotics dealers, and was exposed as an accomplice to gun-running financed with the profits from the narcotics traffic. The White House protected Robert Vesco, who appears to be a central figure in the scheme of heroin smuggling and gun-running.
Continuing. In these 8 points, we find the will, the power, and the motives, not for the once proclaimed victory over the traffickers, but for the dramatic transfer of underworld power that suddenly became a reality in 1973. The syndicate was in on it. The White House, the CIA, and special lobby groups were in on it too, at least indirectly. But we still need to ask who, in particular, and why. We will rely on logic and guesswork only to identify individual accomplices and their particular contributions and motives. Let us consider the Lansky syndicate, represented by Santo Trafficante and his Cuban narcotics mafia. In addition to motives he might have shared with the CIA, Trafficante had many other reasons to take part in the heroin coup. First, it meant cheaper heroin deliveries and therefore greater profits. Second, he He wanted the Corsicans out because, behind his and the rest of the syndicate's backs, they had begun setting up their own U.S. distribution network. Finally, Trafficante's drug mob did not want to see a repeat of BNDD Operation Eagle, U.S. Drug Enforcement's last effective raid against his network. What were the possibilities for Trafficantes playing an active role in the coup's execution, apart from preparation of the Southeast Asia and Mexico-based networks? Without help from the CIA and powerful lobbies, his chances were slim. With their assistance, he could infiltrate the narcotics nerve center, the White House. Here we might discuss just who, in fact, helped him. If it is true that Trafficante fought the Corsicans so bitterly from 1971 on, how can it be that Marcel Beauquin and his shrimp boat were seized in February 1972 with 425 kilos of pure heroin en route to Trafficante in Florida? There is only one explanation, which Beauquin himself offered in court: that Beauquin was set up by his American client. How else can the unprecedented seizure by French customs following a tip from the CIA be explained? If it was a plot to exhaust the stocks of the remaining French heroin rings and thereby cause panic among the Corsicans, then it worked. How guilty was Richard Nixon, who presided over the heroin coup? Personally, I believe that under strong pressure he was a more or less willing tool, rather than the force behind it all. Pointing to Nixon's guilt are his close association with the Cuba lobby, with people connected to Lansky and Trafficante, and with Robert Vesco. In addition, his dirty tricks department relied heavily on Cuban exiles. The Cubans would never have supported him with dangerous criminal acts, demonstrations, donations, and votes if he had really been out to eliminate their most profitable business. Nixon would have been ruining the Cuban mafia and to an extent the syndicate as well, and thereby his friends in Florida. He would have been digging his own grave. Thus, Nixon tackled the drug problem as he did every political problem. He followed the path of least resistance, and that meant ignoring his criminal allies in Florida and Southeast Asia while he hounded the Corsicans, who had no constituency, to death.
That Nixon might have been involved in the heroin coup for his own personal gain is lent credence by the following quote from Dan Molday's respected book, The Hoffa Wars, Charter Books, 1978. A former Nixon aide, not privy to the Hague investigation, says that one of his associates in the White House mentioned to him sometime during the impeachment summer, unquote, that someone high up, maybe White House Chief of Staff General Alexander Haig, was interested in Nixon's possible organized crime involvements, unquote. That conversation involved a massive payoff, unquote, from those in Army Service Club scandals in Vietnam during 1969 or 70. The aide says that the Service Club ripoffs, quote, involved the mafia and millions of dollars, and that the main focus of the interest by someone high up in the White House was on whether the top mafia guy who ran, quote, all these things in Southeast Asia, unquote, had made payoffs to Nixon. The crime figure, he says, was the one who was apparently known as the so-called mastermind or architect of the Southeast Asian drug trade, who was very powerful and very well known as a mob leader. According to government narcotics experts, the central figure in the Indochina Golden Triangle narcotics traffic was Santos Trafficante, unquote. In my opinion, the central manipulator in the whole narcotics scheme was the CIA, or rather a faction within it. It is erroneous to treat the agency as a monolith. Various lobby groups have their own agents in the company, generating internal power struggles that reflect political polarizations external to the CIA. There are, doubtless, CIA factions wholeheartedly in favor of ending America's policeman and oppressor roles, and in favor of social democratic rather than right-wing regimes. Equally certain is the fact that one should take the agency's new, outwardly benign face with a grain of salt. Within the agency, there remain powerful groups promoting continued support of old friends in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The China-Cuba lobby has traditionally been one of the most influential within the CIA, and there is little reason to believe that the situation has seriously changed. Finally, the agency has laid low of late, as the Carter administration has lobbied for a relaxation of constraints placed upon it by Congress in the wake of the 70s exposés of CIA horror stories. In addition to, or rather behind, the CIA's new official policy, there is also an unofficial one. It manifests itself in such matters as the manipulation of the DEA to perform what previously had been CIA dirty work, and in the toleration, if not encouragement, of a large, apparently independent army of Cuban exile terrorists available for action in Latin America at the request of the presiding dictators. The evidence suggests that the forces behind the unofficial policy were able to place many of their loyal CIA agents in the DEA and in such private intelligence agency covers as Intertel and Wackenhut, where they continue their tasks while letting the agency wash its hands. Intelligence is still gathered by the CIA, but some of the dirtiest operations are now performed by former, unquote, agents.
We cannot, of course, discount the possibility that the unofficial policy is in fact executed by former agents who had either been purged from the agency or left in protest against its more moderate line. However, that implies that a renegade CIA faction now runs an independent secret service, aided by lobby interests, in other words, not Intertel, but an even more powerful, quote, third force. If that is so, I could come up with only one lobby group with the relevant motives as well as the power to back them. The World Anti-Communist League, otherwise known as WACL. WACL. WACL can mobilize CIA agents closely associated with the China-Cuba-Chile lobby, especially the large contingent of former agents of the Gehlen-Vlasov organization, in parentheses, the intelligence agency run by Hitler's master spy Reinhard Gehlen, which became the BND, the West German equivalent of the CIA. E. Howard Hunt was clearly the China, Cuban, Latin American lobby's man. That he is also tied to WACL is suggested by the fact that William F. Buckley, Hunt's close friend for 20 years and the godfather of his children, was one of WACL's top U.S. supporters. Also connected to the same lobby groups are Lucien Conein and the State Department's former intelligence chief, Ray S. Klein, who continues to be a frequent guest at the Taiwan World Anti-Communist League stronghold. Hunt and Conein were the vital forces behind the White House's great heroin coup. Hunt secured the Cuban exiles their necessary footing, and he got his friends Bernard Barker and Manuel Artime to set up, quote, hit teams to kidnap and murder Latin American narcotics traffickers. According to Frank Sturgis, those traffickers included members of Auguste Ricord and Christian David's Grupo Francais. Hunt persuaded Agel Crow to bring CIA agents into the White House narcotics apparatus. He told Crow that he knew, quote, key CIA officers who could be temporarily detached from the agency and employed by the new liaison group, unquote. It was Hunt who recommended Lucien Conein to head the group. Finally, it was intelligence reports from the CIA and Conein's group which made White House narcotics actions focus almost exclusively on the Corsicans. Conein's close friend, Mitch Werbel III, told journalist Jim Hogan he, quote, found it difficult to believe that a lifelong spy of Conein's stature could ever really leave the CIA. Accustomed to the use of other government agencies as CIA covers, Werbel quite naturally held open the possibility that Conein's DEA job was no more than an exercise in sheep-dipping the backgrounds and identities of the Dirty Dozen, all of whom were CIA veterans, unquote. The desire to help its old friends in Southeast Asia and Latin America was not the CIA's only motive for promoting the heroin coup. The Gaullists in France, including their loyal adherents in intelligence agency SDECE and their dirty tricksters in SAC, were, in the de Gaulle era, the CIA's arch enemies, as well as rivals for control of the world heroin trade. One can well imagine the CIA joining forces with Georges Pompidou and other pro-U.S. forces in France in crushing the old Gaullist intelligence network. In 1973, with the Corsicans finally pushed out of the picture, the White House reorganized the narcotics effort to form the DEA. Almost immediately, heroin began flowing to the U.S. from new sources of supply. Journalist Ron Rosenbaum cites the following statement by a U.S. Customs official, quote, BNDD and Customs are finally getting somewhere. They break up the French connection. They're getting big conspiracy cases. Suddenly they, the White House, step in and there's this big shakeup, and by the time people get back to work, the Mexican connection is set up, protected, and doing big business. What's that say to you?" Unquote. He might have added that the Southeast Asian connection was also protected and doing big business. The emergence of the DEA was the next to last phase of the heroin coup. Hunt and Conin's CIA agents moved into DEA intelligence and operation, Conin locating 12 Latino CIA agents in his Special Operations Group alone. The Dirty Dozen was officially created to combat Cuban and Latin American narcotics smugglers, allegedly following the assassination approach conceived in the darkest corners of the White House.
It must have been a gag. Conin's forces were apparently directed for the most part against small-time independents who had competed with the big-time traffickers in on the heroin coup. The biggest Cuban network, Santo Traficantes, went untouched. Miami's 1974-75 murder wave in Little Havana might even have been connected to the activities of Conin's Cubans. The victims had opposed Orlando Bosch's drive for solidarity in terrorism, a drive which, as suggested by writer Hogan, might well have enjoyed the support of Traficante and Robert Vesco. Of the latter two, certainly the first and quite possibly the second as well were central figures in the heroin coup. That brings us to the political phase of the heroin coup, which began with the DEA's 1974 takeover of the CIA's Latin American torture and repression apparatus, and ended with the 1976 creation of Kruger, Bosch's terrorist army. Ended is, however, the incorrect word, since the brutalities financed by the heroin coup continue. The DEA, or that part of it penetrated by the CIA, protects the major narcotics dealers. The latter, in turn, support, financially and through gun running, anti-communist paramilitary groups which work hand-in-hand with Latin American police and military forces, whose death squads and torturers are supervised by agents of the DEA. The infiltration of the DEA and the variety of political assignments for its agents have caused such violent splits within the Bureau that one can speak of two wings which fight one another. One wing carries out guns for drugs and protection programs, the other tries desperately to combat the drug traffic carried out or protected by the first. Among the expressions of this bitter internal strife, apparently, are the Cecilia Falcone and Werbel cases and the dismissal of DEA Director Bartels for suspected corruption. Recently, the use of drug profits to finance right-wing terrorism has been placed in a new perspective by revelations of Cuban exile teamwork with European and Latin American fascists and the economic support of the World Anti-Communist League for the same anti-communist groups. And that brings us to the final link in the chain of drugs, intelligence, and fascism. And I would emphasize that our next Radio Free America show is going to cover that final link. And the next link we're going to talk not only about Klaus Barbie and the cocaine situation, but about this final intersection, the final link, as Kruger puts it, in the chain of drugs, intelligence, and fascism. Let me add that broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills, we're not going to go to that last section, this next topic in tonight's broadcast. We're going to read a little bit more about the actual results of Kruger's thesis here, the Great Heroin Coup, the use of former CIA agents in the DEA not to eliminate the heroin traffic, but to corner it for Nixon's intelligence and organized crime allies. We're going to look at the results of the heroin coup in terms of the actual heroin traffic itself, because the actual subject of the use of the DEA and narcotics trafficking for right-wing terror is going to occupy the bulk of our next broadcast. We should actually have some time for some phone calls here, maybe after a telephone break, but we're going to continue with some more information here.
All right, reading a little bit more from the Great Heroin Coup. From 1975 until the end of 1978, the DEA consistently maintained that between 80 and 90% of the heroin consumed in the United States was Mexican. However, the claim doesn't stand up against the following facts. 1. 80% of the world's heroin, exactly the figure exported from Marseille until 1972, was, at least until late 1976, produced from opium harvested in the Golden Triangle and distributed via Bangkok, Singapore, and Hong Kong. 2. The number of arrests of couriers en route from Southeast Asia increased steadily after 1973. 3. Reports from New York and other big cities testified to the arrival of large shipments of white heroin from Southeast Asia. 4. The market supply of heroin did not dwindle despite aerial destruction of an estimated 60% of Mexico's poppy fields in early 1976. 5. An effective tidal wave of Golden Triangle heroin began flooding Europe in 1973, while many couriers en route to the U.S. and Canada were nabbed by European police. 6. The DEA was aware of Santo Traficante's dealings in Southeast Asia, as well as the later Mafia summit in Palermo, where large sums of money were set aside for investment in the Golden Triangle. 7. It was easy to verify the narcotics flow from Mexico since the border was subject to close surveillance, but to conclude that most of the heroin on the U.S. market originated in Mexico was a stretch of logic. Even the DEA had to admit the tenuousness of its claims. On February 24, 1976, the DEA's John Cusack, C-U-S-A-C-K, admitted that his agency's estimate that only 8% of U.S. heroin came from Southeast Asia was surprising, considering the region's prolific opium production. He added, quote, "We are also concerned about our detection during 1975 of substantial quantities of white number 4 heroin moving directly from Bangkok to the United States. In December, for example, 46 kilograms of heroin were seized in Bangkok, concealed in the household effects shipment of a returning U.S. serviceman. Follow-up investigation and the development of an extensive conspiracy prosecution has identified 12 additional shipments entering the United States since 1974." Unquote. 12 such shipments meant 552 kilos, or more than the entire 472 kilos confiscated in the U.S. in 1975, and from only one of many Southeast Asian smuggling networks. Cusack went even further. Quote, "It appears almost certain that the bulk of the white heroin found during 1975 in the inner city areas of our eastern cities has been Asian number 4, smuggled from Bangkok."
Why then did the DEA continue to overstate Mexico's role and minimize Southeast Asia, even after the publication in 1972 of Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia? Perhaps to justify the great expenditure in support of right-wing military and police forces in Latin America. The later boom in Colombian cocaine would also provide justification. Southeast Asia was downplayed so as not to jeopardize relations with America's loyal, if corrupt, allies, most of all Thailand, Taiwan, and the latter's overseas agents. They were allowed to profit from opium and heroin in relative peace. Another reason. The DEA could not expose the Southeast Asia connection without compromising the CIA. A secret 1977 House Government Operations Subcommittee report accused the CIA of helping an Asian opium ring smuggle drugs into the United States and then lying about it to Congress. Puttaporn Kruan, Puttaporn, Khram, a Thai national, was arrested in 1973 for smuggling 59 pounds of pure opium into the U.S. via JFK Airport. Citing national security interests, the agency had the case squelched, and Kruan was sent back home. However, the House committee eventually established that he was a CIA operative in Thailand. In fact, he was on the payroll of a CIA proprietary using the Agency for International Development, AID, as a cover for training the corrupt Thai border police. Furthermore, Kruan told a DEA investigator that he had been an officer in the Kuomintang Army and guarded opium mule caravans. His CIA contact was the U.S. consul in Chiang Mai, Thailand. In its report, the House committee stated, quote, "It was ironic that the CIA should be given the responsibility of narcotics intelligence, particularly since they are supporting the prime movers," unquote. I'm going to read that last sentence again, quoting from a House committee report. "It was ironic that the CIA should be given the responsibility of narcotics intelligence, particularly since they are supporting the prime movers." In March 1977, the DEA began to speak of major maneuvers in the international Asian narcotics market for a share of the U.S. drug scene, unquote, and of a coalition between the U.S. Mafia, the Corsicans, and the Chu Chao Chinese triad, unquote. The coalition had in reality existed at least since 1970, and perhaps as early as Traficante's 1968 journey to the East, and it had functioned effectively, shipping large amounts of heroin to the U.S. since 1972 and 3. The difference was that the Corsican arm of the coalition, their own umbrella organization having been smashed, was now essentially reduced to some 100 men working with the U.S. Mafia and the Chinese, most of them as chemists in Thailand's mobile heroin labs. Who has controlled the Golden Triangle opium traffic and heroin production since the establishment of the Mafia-Chinese coalition, besides the CIA, that is? The answer is the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang Chinese and Overseas Chu Chao Syndicate, men such as Chang Chi-fu, Lo Sing-han, Tsai Chien-cheng, and older, more familiar figures like General Lai Mi. Still head of what's left of the Kuomintang forces, General Li resides in luxury outside Chiang Mai and received official visits there from the United States as recently as late 1976. In 1976 and 7, a minor war was about to erupt over the control of the region's opium traffic and mobile refineries. Potential combatants were Chu Chi-fu's United Shan Army of rebels against the Burmese regime and Kuomintang forces under General Li. However, the opposing leaders were brought together by a senior Thai officer, and an agreement was reached on the marketing of drugs and supply of arms to fight communist forces in Burma's Shan states. Again, we see the connection between narcotics and anti-communist paramilitary operations, albeit Chu Chi-fu later pulled out of the agreement, was arrested in Thailand, and eventually extradited to Burma. The DEA's Golden Triangle Unit, SNO, made many whole and half-hearted attempts to eradicate the narcotics plague. All failed. Production has been great, the world's heroin market having multiplied in the 70s. SNA won't say outright that the CIA is undermining them, nor that politics underlies their constant failures. An SNO agent, nevertheless, came close to doing this in his 1976 statement to Alfred McCoy, quote, "If they were selling shares in Golden Triangle Heroin Incorporated in 5, 10, and 20-year bonds, I would put my money on a 20-year bond. The only thing that would end the whole Golden Triangle business would be a communist takeover in Thailand. If that happened, I'd sell my stock," unquote. Here again, the point being that the Great Heroin Coup not only shifted the control of the heroin traffic from the Corsican Syndicate to their Sicilian and Cuban and CIA competitors, but beyond that, the main focus of the heroin traffic was not Mexico, as was being bandied about, I should say, by the DEA, but rather Southeast Asia. And I think it's worth bearing in mind Kruger's, not only his analysis of the possible role of the Galen World Anti-Communist League organization in this narcotics traffic and the use of parallel police for anti-communist terror, read anti-democratic terror, because according to Wackel and CIA elements, basically a communist is anyone who doesn't believe in fascism, and I think that there are an awful lot of graves marked and unmarked all around the world that would testify to that. Graves of priests, school teachers, and all kinds of other people who were not communists, but were not fascists either, and paid dearly for that philosophy. I think it's worth considering the tremendous amount of press being given to Mexico as a center of corruption and drug traffic to this day, and whether or not the attention being focused on Mexico again serves to provide the pretext for the use of the DEA and other organizations for the use of intelligence and, quote, anti-communist, read fascist operations.
Indeed, and also, as we were talking about at the beginning of the broadcast, many of the current things going on in terms of not just the Iran and Nicaraguan scandal story coming out, but a lot of the current administration policy has begun to come back in bits and pieces as being tied into the narcotics trade. Of course, we have become massive suppliers in the past 7-8 years now of the Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen, through Pakistan. Of course, this is one of the reasons that General Zia al-Haq is still in charge in Pakistan. The man is it's a military government. It's practically martial law in Pakistan. And Zia al-Haq, of course, is our man there, and we are using Pakistan as our conduit for weapons to the Mujahideen guerrillas. But on the flip side, recently, packages of hashish have been showing up in the United States with the Mujahideen slogans and propaganda on them. Buy a gram of hash, kill a Russian, etc., that sort of thing. That's just one example. Of course, we talked at great length about what's going on with Nicaragua. Now, interestingly enough, at the time that now remember George Bush, our current vice president, And remember, too, also, this is a rather interesting parallel because of Richard Nixon, as vice president, sort of putting together his connections to the drug trade and these other various trades and the intelligence apparatus and all these things, preparatory to becoming president, as he felt he would in 1960, and setting up things like the Bay of Pigs operation, again, thinking that he was going to be the president in 1960. Bear that in mind with George Bush, who, of course, is the heir apparent. George Bush himself also naturally a former DCIA, director of the CIA, during the time a lot of this stuff was being consolidated in 1975 and 1976. And a lot of the connections between the CIA and the Latin American death squads are becoming institutionalized. More recently, as vice president, George Bush was down in Florida as head of a DEA task force that was supposedly going to put the blocks to the drug traffic once and for all. Well, leaving the obvious absurdity of that aside, since as we've talked about at great length, and we'll talk at even greater length during the next Radio Free America, the cocaine trade is largely a creature of the right wing, the American right wing and the Latin American right wing, with some help from the European right wing. But leaving the absurdity of George Bush's claim that he's stamping it out aside, one of those very self-same former CIA agents who we talked about at great length, Frank Turple, suggested that in fact George Bush's whole DEA operation in Florida was just a further excuse to inject the CIA, to use the DEA as a form of hypodermic, which is in fact what Henrik Kruger is talking about, using the DEA as a form of hypodermic to inject the CIA covertly into further areas of Latin American politics. Now, besides the Great Heroin Coup, which is probably the best source for the stuff we're talking about tonight, which is why we use it at such great length, the cited book, Alfred McCoy's Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, lays out a lot of the ground we've talked about in earlier broadcasts. There's some rather interesting things that crop up in some other books as well. I'm going to recommend one or two, and I think Dave's got some to recommend. One of them is a book called Hidden Terrors by A.J. Langeth, which goes in some length about the AID connections, the Aid for International Development. They were talking in the Great Heroin Coup. Kruger was talking about police officers who are trained in these terror factories, essentially in the United States, and sent back down to Latin America, oftentimes with CIA and DEA oversight, trained in basically repressive measures, torture and assassination. And Hidden Terrors by A.J. Langeth, formerly a writer, I believe, for the New York Times, is a book entirely about the death of Dan Mitrione, an American police chief who, with connections to the CIA, who was in fact just that kind of American operative in Latin America, Uruguay and Brazil, among others. There are a variety of other books. Spooks by James Hogan. James Hogan was quoted during this book, is one that you might also want to check out.
There are a couple of other books. I would like to emphasize, though, that the material here is probably the best, we'll go into those perhaps in a second, the best single analysis of the interrelationship between, as Kruger puts it, drugs, intelligence, and international fascism ever done. And again, the use of the DEA not only to corner the narcotics traffic, but in turn as a vehicle of the U.S. intelligence apparatus and as a major adjunct to the Latin American terror campaigns shouldn't be overlooked. We're kicking around the possibility, obviously it'll have to be clear to the programming, of perhaps in May, during KFJC's Month of Mayhem, when we do particular special programming, maybe doing a two-part series on Iranagua or Irangate, Contragate, where we will review not only the anti-Castro Cubans, many of the same elements involved in the Kourou-Bosch terror campaign, their involvement in this whole situation, and the role of narcotics and the narcotics traffic in the system that we're seeing down that's exploding right now on the U.S. scene, and in terms of the Iran-Contragate scandal. In our next broadcast, we will be talking about the cocaine trade and taking Kruger's next step, the development of the narcotics traffic as a major source of quote, anti-communist terror. And again, the working definition of a communist being anybody who opposes fascism. And I think the activities, for example, in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Argentina will bear very eloquent, if perhaps silent, witness to that situation. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador was not exactly a flaming communist, and yet he was assassinated by these, quote, anti-communist death squads. I think that's a good example. We will be talking about that not only in our next broadcast, but like I said, possibly in May, we're going to take up the Iran-Contragate scandal in maybe a two-part archive series. We would like to let it percolate for a little while, because obviously there's more information coming out. We were going to do one after our second program, but so much has come out since that we're both pretty glad that we did not leap ahead, since any archive show that we would have done at that time would be awfully incomplete compared to what we have coming out. At the same time, we don't want to let it develop like we did the Pope shooting, because we don't have to do five-hour things, you know, in a future day. I'll say that for sure. But going back to some good books to read on the subject, there's an excellent book called Of Grass and Snow by Hank Messick, the author of Lansky, one of the definitive works on Meyer Lansky, a key player in the Nixon White House and this whole great heroin coup scenario proposed by Henry Kruger. Also an excellent book called The Heroin Trail by the authors of Newsday. Also the aforementioned Apar by L.H. Whittemore, talking about the suppression of the Robert Vesco connection. I think it's worth mentioning, too, that Robert Vesco has been mentioned as being among the people who was involved with alleged Sandinista drug trafficking and alleged Castro-Cuban drug trafficking, whereas, as we've seen, Robert Vesco's affiliations are primarily on the other side of the fence, and indeed, the alleged Sandinista drug smuggling has now appeared to be not only not Sandinista, but indeed Contra-drug smuggling with the case of Adler-Barry Seal, something we will be taking up when we go into Iran-Contra-gate. So, again, there's a lot of information that we've presented this evening. What we're going to do now is take a musical break. We haven't got a phone screener with us, but if people would like to phone in and discuss some of the information we've talked about, we do have almost 45 minutes until 11 o'clock. You should treasure the opportunity. We seldom have phone calls in one of our archive shows, but this is sort of the end of one major phase of what we've been talking about, and rather than take up what is really the subject of an entire next archive show, our fourth in this series, and we got at least one more to talk about how the CIA unloaded the psychedelic era, quote-unquote, on people, we thought rather than sort of open another whole door, we'd sort of seal off the entity here. But the phone number up here is area code 415-941-2500. What we'll do is we'll take 3 calls, screen 3 calls, and then go and take the calls, and then if we, depending on how fast they go, put on some more music, screen 3 more calls, and so forth. So if people would like to call in at this point, we have almost 45 minutes.
That's right. Now, there's always the possibilities that everybody has their tapes on, and they're not going to find out that we're calling for phone calls until they put the tape on tomorrow. But we will take a musical break, and if you are out there and you would like to talk about some of this stuff, as Dave mentioned, I think it's been about 12 or 13 or maybe